万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world 尝试吧。
欢迎来到我们的华尔街电视简报节目。今天我们有一系列精彩的新闻要分享给大家。首先，让我们飞跃到中国，看看国际航班的复苏情况。边境入境限制得到放宽后，中国的国际航班数量显著增加，乘客负载率达到了疫情前水平的 82%。旅行兴趣的增加归因于边境的重新开放以及旅行限制和入境要求的逐渐放宽。不过，中国作为旅游目的地的声誉因民族主义情绪和与西方的紧张关系而受到打击。接下来我们转向中国的房地产市场，尽管房地产投资和销售仍在持续下降，但下降速度有所放缓，表明市场开始稳定。与此同时，中国国家海洋石油公司在渤海发现了一个1亿吨的油田，这是中海油努力投资于中国海上油气储量开发的一部分，以抵消陆上老油田产量下降的影响。最后我们来看看一些国际新闻。欧盟正在考虑与美国一起评估中国传统芯片的风险，这可能导致对中国在半导体领域的主导地位采取联合措施。此外，一项中国英国的研究发现，肠道细菌可能在眼部疾病中起到一定作用。而在韩国，尽管以肉食为主，但越来越多的人采取了无块方法，遵循以植物为中心的饮食。这就是今天的新闻。今天的新闻概述，希望今天的新闻请大家喜欢，请大家喜欢，请大家喜欢。中国国际航班终于开始复苏，因为边境入境限制得到放宽。南华早报，中国国际航班数量显著增加，2月份的乘客负载率达到了疫情前水平的 82%。与2023年同期相比，1月和2月的国际航班数量增长了 707%。旅行兴趣的增加归因于边境的重新开放以及旅行限制和入境要求的逐渐放宽。分析师预测，独立海外旅行和小团体旅游将继续在市场份额上快速增长。然而，由于民族主义情绪和与西方的紧张关系升温，中国作为旅游目的地的声誉受到了打击。中国房地产官方统计数据显示，投资下降速度放缓。南华早报，尽管下降速度有所放缓，但中国内地的房地产投资和销售仍在持续下降。人民市场态势稳定。国家统计局的数据，1月和2月的总房地产投资同比下降 9%， 达到 1.18 万亿元人民币和1645亿美元。住宅房地产投资下降7%，达到8823亿元人民币。今年前2个月的房地产销售面积同比下降20%，而2023年全年下降 8.5%。 尽管下降，分析师们认为投资下降幅度的缩小和竞争格局的变化表明市场正在稳定。中国国家海洋石油公司在渤海发现了一个1亿吨的油田。日经亚洲，中国国有石油天然气巨头中海油宣布在渤海发现了一个重大油田的发现，增加了超过1亿吨的石油当量的证明储量。此前，中海油宣布在南海发现了一个新的储量，这些发现是中海油努力投资于中国海上油气储量开发的一部分，以抵消陆上老油田产量下的影响。该公司将其2024年产量目标提高到创纪录的 7.2022 亿桶石油当量。中国任命曾在新疆工作的外交部发言人。彭博社，中国任命了林健为外交部发言人，他曾是受到制裁的新疆生产建设兵团 XBC 七级的员工。XBC 七级因涉嫌侵犯人权而在2020年被美国制裁。林健的任命是在中美两国努力修复紧张关系之际。当被问及与 XBC 七的关系时，林健回避了问题，称中国官员在地方省份和地区工作是常规做法。欧盟正在考虑与美国一起评估中国传统芯片的风险。彭博社，欧盟 EU 正在考虑对其对中国成熟或低端芯片的依赖进行正式审查，原因是存在潜在的国家安全风险和对全球供应链的担忧。欧盟正考虑调查这些半导体在各个行业中的深度嵌入程度。这是继美国拜登政府采取类似举措之后的又一举措。欧盟和美国可能会制定联合措施， 因对中国在半导体领域的主导地位可能对全球供应链造成了扭曲效应。这个问题将在4月份的欧盟美国贸易和技术理事会会议上讨论。人们担心中国在芯片生产方面的投资可能导致市场扭曲或关键依赖。肠胃细菌可能在眼部疾病中起到一定作用。英国的研究发现，南华早报据中国中山大学和伦敦大学学院的科学家称，肠道细菌可能会导致引发失明的眼部疾病。这项发表在《细胞》杂志上的研究指出，在对于这些疾病相关的250个基因进行研究时，发现一种名为7B1的基因存在于眼睛和肠道的保护性细胞层中。科学家们发现抗生素可以阻止小鼠疾病的进展。他们表示，虽然抗生素无法逆转眼部损伤，但可以用于治疗这种疾病。香港加密货币托管公司 Hextrust 计划在2024年实现盈利，并寻求新的融资。南华早报位于香港的加密货币托管公司 Hextrust 计划在今年筹集新资金并实现盈利。尽管可能面临监管挑战，该公司预计在2023年通过削减成本 20% 后实现盈利。同时，加密货币价格飙升 ，Hextrust 计划开始就新一轮融资展开讨论，但尚未确定是在今年上半年还是下半年进行。该公司在2022年3月进行的 B 轮融资中筹集了8800万美元。然而 Hextrust 表示，香港针对更广泛的虚拟资产行业的拟议监管框架可能给其在该市的运营带来阻力。如何在肉食爱好者的天堂韩国成为纯素食者？华盛顿邮报，韩国以其对肉类和以肉为基础的菜肴的热爱而闻名，这使得一些人难以接受素食或纯素食的生活方式。然而，越来越多的人采取了无坏方法，即在外出就餐或与他人一起进餐时避免食用明显的肉块。虽然只有 4% 的韩国人自称为素食主义者，但有 12% 的人表示他们遵循以植物为中心的饮食。社交媒体在推广韩国的植物为基础的生活方式方面发挥了重要作用。一些标签如我的纯素主义日记和 Instagram 帖子鼓励其他人加入这个挑战。商界对植物为基础的替代品也越来越感兴趣，一些公司看到了替代蛋白质来源的潜在市场。韩国政府还公布了支持植物为基础经济的计划，并建立了一个专门研究植物为基础的肉类替代品的中心。然而，韩国仍然有很多肉食爱好者，一些人对植物为基础的饮食持怀疑态度。迪拜王室侄子将在香港设立5亿美元的家族办公室，为香港金融中心注入动力。南华早报早穆德只是谢赫·穆罕默德本为马克图姆的侄子谢赫·阿里·阿勒马克图姆的侄子谢赫·阿里·阿勒马克图姆将在香港开设一个家族办公室。这家投资公司将管理高达5亿美元的资金，并寻找亚洲的机会，包括人工智能、建筑、电动汽车、旅游和金融科技等领域。香港一直在努力吸引超级富豪并引入税收和居住福利，该城市还加大了吸引家族办公室的努力，目标是到2025年底说服拥有100万美元资产的200多个家族办公室在香港设立或扩大业务。中国军方最近表现出克制，台湾官员表示，彭博社据报道，自台湾1月选举以来，中国据称已经减少了对台湾的军事压力，但预计将继续进行外交孤立运动。根据2名安全官员的说法，自选举以来，中国在台湾周围的海军和空军活动并未增加。这些官员表示，中国可能正在等待看待新当选的总统赖清德政府的运作方式。中国声称台湾是其领下一步形成台湾是其领土，并誓言将该岛纳入其控制之下。乔拜登总统承诺，如果台湾遭到攻击，将保卫台湾。亚洲的办公楼市正在蓬勃发展，那么投资者在哪里呢？南华早报亚洲办公市场受到了疫情推动的混合办公方式转变的影响较小，但该行业的投资活动大幅下降。尽管印度的租赁活动强劲，在中国去年的办公空间净吸纳量仅略2020年的历史最低水平。一些亚洲办公市场如印度受益于成本控制措施和较低的租金价值，而其他市场则受到强劲的国内投资者基础的支持。然而，该行业需要一个更强的叙述来区别于美国和欧洲的同行。印度的多阶段选举将持续44天，以下持续4年需要这么长时间的原因。关键是印度正在举行世界上规模最大的民主选举，共有 9.7 亿人有资格在4月19日至6月1日期间投票。该选民的规模超过了一段条文。该国分为543个选区，每个选区在7个阶段内进行投票。印度选举委员会负责监督选举，必须确保每个注册选民在2公里范围内有一个投票站。大约有1500万选举官员和安保人员将覆盖整个国家，经常穿越困难的地形以接触每个选民。上面播报的内容是6度团队推荐的全球专业媒体智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道分析简报。更详细的内容请大家去这些媒体智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映6度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。6度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体， 大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是 6w， 靠您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到6度简报。
欢迎来到我们的华尔街评论节目。今天我们要聊聊几个重磅话题，让我们一起来看看地球的未来、假新闻的世界以及拜登总统的新行政命令吧。首先，我们得面对一个不太乐观的现实，我们对地球资源的掠夺正让我们付出代价。世界卫生组织 WHO 发出警告，气候变化、污染和生物多样性的丧失正导致更频繁和更严重的天气事件，而这一切都是因为我们几个世纪以来对地球的掠夺。同时，拜登总统将签署一项行政命令，扩大对女性健康的研究，这是一个积极的进步，旨在将女性健康整合到联邦研究项目和预算中。接着，我们来聊聊假新闻的世界。在这个数字时代，我们如何分辨真假新闻呢？一张编辑过的照片，一句名人的话，这些都可能不是真的。我们需要更加小心，因为假新闻的风险无处不在。同时，大国竞争也来到了南极洲，随着气候变化和对资源的需求增加，南极洲的政治格局正在发生变化，这对全球都是一个挑战。最后，我们来看看美国外交政策的革命。参议员伯尼·桑德斯呼吁美国外交政策进行根本性的重新定位，优先考虑人权、多边主义和全球团结。这是一个值得关注的话题，因为它关乎美国在全球的角色和影响力。好了，这就是今天的新闻概述。感谢大家的收听，希望这些话题能引起大家的思考。请大家继续收看详细内容，我们下次节目再见。几个世纪以来，我们一直在掠夺地球资源，现在我们正在为此付出代价。英国电讯报评论版。世界卫生组织呼吁采取一体化健康方法来应对气候变化、污染和生物多样性丧失。在卫报上发表的一篇观点文章中， WHO 代表表示，这3个问题导致了更频繁和更严重的天气事件，进而导致死亡和伤害。与此同时，日益增多的热浪导致心血管疾病的发生，空气污染导致肺癌、哮喘和慢性阻塞性肺疾病，铅等化学物质导致智力障碍、心血管疾病和肾脏疾病。WHO 估计，污染、废物和化学物质每年造成1400万人死亡，占全球疾病负担的 25%。 假新闻世界中可信承诺的一课。美国企业研究所。据信，已故女王伊丽莎白2世曾经说过一句名言：我必须被看到才能被相信。虽然女王陛下的话被认为是只定义她独特时尚风格的鲜艳服装和大帽子，但她睿智的话语在现代数字世界中是有先见之明的。这是他的孙子威尔士亲王和他的妻子现在可能希望他们能更真实的接受一点教训。3月10日星期日，王子和他的妻子在社交媒体上发布了一张公主和他们的3个孩子的官方照片，以纪念母亲节。这张照片显然是王子拍摄的，是自圣诞节以来公主发布的第1张照片。自从1月17日宣布她正在接受计划中的腹部手术以来，公主就一直没有出现在公众视线中。通过 2020.com， 虽然一些媒体不加批判地转载了这张照片，但其他媒体选择对它进行更多的尽职调查。发布后不到12小时，美联社宣布，在对图像进行仔细检查后，由于未指明的操纵，他们不会分发它。Getty Images 和路透社警告新闻媒体强制杀人。数字编辑的证据意味着发布它将违反公司的编辑政策，禁止发布经过更改或数字处理的图像，而不是次要的照片编辑，例如裁剪或颜色调整。公主随后为编辑道歉，并指出像许多其他业余摄影师一样，她偶尔会使用软件来修饰图像。新闻机构没有直接指责王室散布假新闻，但鉴于公主长期不在公众视野中，以及关于她的信息匮乏与她的岳父查尔斯3世国王形成鲜明对比，查尔斯3世国王在接受癌症治疗时提供了更多信息。没过多久，公众舆论法庭就提出了这种可能性，并用一大堆关于宫殿可能掩盖的理论来填补新闻空白。虽然最终公众人物不可避免的会以这种方式被抓获，这引出了一个问题，即为什么这是新闻机构第一次以这种方式做出回应，因为他们提供的至少一些材料可能同样被数字处理过， 但该案凸显了当不能假设照片或任何其他数字内容可以被信任时所面临的困难真相。然而，假新闻的风险并不新鲜。幸运的是，许多经济工具已经发展起来，以减少被虚伪的信使误导的风险。一种是可信的承诺，它来自自愿将一些重要的东西置于危险之中，如果后来发现真相没有被告知，就会被没收。如果品牌未能履行其承诺，则为建立品牌而投入的巨额资金将被没收，销售损失。由于现在以数字方式制作和发布假新闻几乎是免费的，人工智能的应用意味着我们将看到更多，而我们可用的工具并不擅长从令人难以置信的中过滤出可信的。如果我们不想被愚弄，我们将不得不更多的依赖现实世界中代价高昂的可信承诺。因此，面对面参与的价值在数字媒体世界中具有新的重要性。亲自出庭所付出的代价成为一种可信的承诺。在家中在线参加烦人的会议更便宜。但是，如果您想表明您致力于该事业或组织或其他，那么亲自参加的费用会传达新的信息，或者待在家里可能会被错误地解释为缺乏承诺。亲自到场肯定可以避免错误推断错误信号的可能性，但这要花钱。已故女王当然知道她的可信度取决于被人亲眼看到，这些衣服只会让她更容易被发现。国王也是如此，他未被触及的照片和视频显示他显然还活着，但身体不适，这对他的自我形象来说代价高昂。也许王子和公主正在学习，公主被拍到离开温莎城堡，但这张照片也可以信任吗？拜登将签署行政命令，扩大对女性健康的研究。国会山报观点：拜登总统将签署一项行政命令，扩大研究并改进政府在妇女健康方面的倡议。该命令旨在将妇女健康整合和优先考虑到联邦研究项目和预算中，重点关注政府的妇女健康研究倡议。它指示相关机构加强研究和数据标准，优先资助妇女健康研究，并鼓励创新。行政命令还指示管理和预算办公室以及性别政策委员会评估联邦资金的差距，并确定潜在的变化。作为公告的一部分，将通过各个联邦机构宣布20多项承诺和行动，包括在2025财年投资2亿美元用于新的妇女健康研究的启动。行政命令的签署与白宫为庆祝妇女历史月举办的招待会同时进行。大国竞争来到南极洲。外交事务。随着气候变化和对资源需求的增加，南极洲的现状正在解体。大国竞争正在加剧，中国、伊朗等国正在推动制裁活动的边界，并考虑领土主张。中国在南极洲的扩张在南极条约的法律允许范围内，但人们对其研究站的潜在军事用途仍存有疑虑。南极洲的政治正在转变，利益相关者必须加强公共机构和利益，以支持条约建立的基于规则的秩序的延续。南极洲富含矿产、石油、天然气和磷虾渔业等资源。它对全球通信至关重要，因为它提供了通往太空的明确路径。南极洲的无军事冲突状况造成了一种虚假的安全感，决策者必须认识到现状的脆弱性。有必要揭示破坏稳定的活动，并增强各国在南极洲的存在，以遏制资源竞争。南极条约禁止军事活动并促进科学合作，使南极洲成为一个中立的国际场所。然而，条约体系正面临压力，对执法机制存在担忧。灰色地带战术利用条约体系的模糊性增加，各国正在测试他们能够逃脱惩罚的界限。特别是中国和俄罗斯一直在进行模糊民用和军事行动之间界限的活动。南极条约体系几十年来一直成功地维护着稳定，但大国竞争的回归带来了新的不稳定因素。中国在南极洲的日益增长的存在和能力，以及其将科学研究与军事活动相结合的战略方法，带来了安全隐患。西方国家必须追究中国的责任，审查其极地研究部门，并增加国际检查。应该加强合作的领域，努力解决南极旅游的环境影响。南极洲目前的现状岌岌可危，利益相关者必须认识到失败的条约体系带来的共同威胁。美国外交政策的革命。外交事务。美国的外交政策一直存在严重缺陷和破坏性，从参与战争和政变，到贸易协议和对威权政权的支持， 这是参议员伯尼·桑德斯写到的。他认为，是时候对美国的外交政策进行根本性重新定位，优先考虑人权、多边主义和全球团结。这个新愿景应该解决气候变化、全球大流行病、财富不平等和逃税等问题，并侧重于建立基于国际法和合作的世界秩序。桑德斯批评了主导美国外交政策数十年的两党共识，指出这导致了灾难性的战争、美国信誉的侵蚀以及将企业利益置于人民需求之上。他呼吁结束无休止的战争和国防合同，推动有利于工人和穷人的公平贸易协议，并削减过度的军事开支。他还主张更加有力地支持国际机构，如联合国和世界卫生组织，并对战争获利和逃税行为进行更严格的问责。通过将外交政策的重点转向人权、经济发展和全球合作等问题，美国不仅可以解决世界上最紧迫的挑战，还可以恢复自身的信誉并加强其民主机构。桑德斯认为，这种外交政策的转变将使美国人民和国际社会受益，带来更大的正义、繁荣和稳定。最终，他断言美国最大的力量在于其自由和民主的价值观，他必须在外交政策决策中优先考虑这些价值观。英国君主制是否正在失去其魔力？外交政策。本文讨论了英国君主制在现代世界中的角色以及其如何演变。文章提到了一张编辑过的凯瑟琳公主和她的孩子的照片，引发了社交媒体上的阴谋论争议。文章还讨论了哈里王子和梅根·马克尔过去可能被用于外交政策目的，但现在有了不同的角色。文章提到了安德鲁王子与杰弗里·爱泼斯坦的纠缠，以及他缺乏通常的国家事务借口。文章最后讨论了君主制需要适应并在面对时代变革时保护其魅力的必要性。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是6度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映6度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。6度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到6度简报。
观众朋友们好，欢迎大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。近期耶鲁大学一位经常关注中国经济问题的教授叫做史蒂芬·罗奇在这个《金融时报》上写了一篇文章，引起了非常大的争议，宣布香港已经完蛋了。那么这个罗奇是不是一直唱衰中国的人呢？其实可能大家想的正好相反，他一直是非常典型的中国牛派看法，对于中国经济一直非常看好。那么他为什么在《金融时报》上这一篇文章会引起这么大的反弹呢？其实有很多是误解的因素那么罗奇呢，他在这个报业新迪加上专门写了一篇文章来澄清他对于中国经济的看法。今天呢，我们率先向大家介绍这一篇文章他就讲到说现在中国的确是面临着很多的经济问题，但是在他看来最糟糕的是中国当局对于这些挑战的回应往往没有进行突破性的富有想象力的解决方案，还是采用的一般性的这样的一个策略。他说其实呢，在过去的25年中的大部分时间，我对中国都是非常持坚定乐观态度的。像我现在认为中国领导层缺乏想象力，做出这样的结论呢，其实对我来讲也是一个相当困难的事情。他在耶鲁大学专门开设了一个课程，叫做下一个中国，讲的就是中国增长模式的变化，从一个以投资和出口为导向的经济体，转向由国内消费驱动的内生性经济体的转变。他说的确我也知道中国有很多薄弱的地方，比如社会安全网，不管是退休还是医疗保健，可能会导致预防性储蓄的增加，可能会抑制消费需求。但是罗奇自己始终相信这一些是挑战而不是危险，中国最后还是会平衡经济。那么他是什么时候开始对于中国经济决策层的想象力产生了某一种失望的态势呢？ 在2021年的时候，当时中国的监管机构对于互联网公司进行监管打击，随后这一场打击让更多的企业家似乎信心丧失了。当时罗奇就觉得好像事情有一点不太对了。他在他的书《偶然冲突》中就警告说，现在这样的一个经济政策的运行方式，可能会对于企业家的动物精神产生很大的影响，包括共同富裕可能都会对于中国这一种创业精神造成不利的长久影响。结果1年后，他说我终于是对习近平举手投降了，发现我这样的一个中国乐观主义者也没有办法看到这样的一代经济领导层怎样能让中国重新复活经济活力。他说其实对于我这种态度的转变很多人都对我嘲笑他也呈现了非常多的批评看法。很多的美国政客长期对于中国持有偏见，现在他们指着我的鼻子大笑，说你终于承认了我们一直以来就是对的。还有很多媒体同行之前一直对于中国有很多批判性的文章，现在也说这样的一只中国牛也变成中国熊了。他说其实呢，在过去的几个月里我呢是和中国进行了一系列之间的高级访问，包括对于商界领袖、中国的高级官员、学者，他之前在耶鲁大学的学生很多呢现在已经是中国各行各业的精英人士了。他说说我呢必须要澄清，现在我对中国经济的看法到底是一个怎样的态势，可能和你们在媒体上看到那种简而非黑即白的过去一片唱好，现在全部唱衰是不太一样的。他说说首先我认为中国对于现在的经济出现困境的政策回应是不明智的。他说说政府仍然是依靠长期以来的所谓的积极的财政刺激政策，还有审慎的货币政策来对于经济增长进行某一种扶植。那么这基本是和97年、98年亚洲金融危机、2008年全球金融危机之后的情况是一样的。而我们也知道，这一种短期的反周期政策，比如说这个就是我们说的财政和货币政策，那么正是造成现在房地产市场、地方政府融资平台还有股市主要混乱的原因之一。虽然说中国现在在这一方面的政策上是没有大开放水闸，但是我们看不出来你到底拿出了怎样创新性的方式来救市。他说我们也知道劳动者减少，一个基本的经济学规律就是人口下降，你要保持稳定的 GDP 增长，那每一个工人的生产效率就要提高，这是基本的数字。但是现在很难看到生产力增长加速的前景，至少没有从领导层听到更多的有关于怎样给中国劳动者赋能的方案。因此他认为不是说你什么都没有做，而是你这些政策还是老那一套，让人感到没有惊喜，没有新鲜感。解决旧问题或许还可以，解决新问题让人看不到你这个领导层的想象力和魄力在哪里。同时他也讲到说，现在我也特别注意到对于安全的关注，对于这个私营部门之前的这些监管公示好像是领取了一些教训又没有领取教训，还有一些这些断断续续时不时重新开始的监管公示，让人摸不清头脑。你到底是要强调什么？经济发展给私营企业更多的生存以及服务的空间，还是要延续之前的监管态势？好像一会儿转一个风向，一会儿转一个风向，领导层还是没有坚定下来决心，以一个完全开放的这样的一个态势，让中国经济重回正轨。在刚刚结束的这个中央纪委的第3次会议上，你还是在强调把意识形态纪律作为最基本的价值。在大学，清华上海交大中国一些最具创新力的大学，你甚至把校长和书记又合并为一，更强化了外界对于党要接管中国科技创新的这样的一种不良的看法。而所有这一些就让罗奇对于现在中国领导层的经济决策的这样的一种能力、信息反馈的活力，以及对于中国能不能够拿出创新性方案，对于经济进行革命性刺激的本事产生了怀疑。因此他说正如克鲁格曼在预警亚洲金融危机时所说的，中国以及其他的亚洲经济体在所落模型中最欠缺的是什么呢？就是 嵌入灵感天才的生产力剩余缺失，也就是想象力的缺失。他说呀，领导层的想象力赤字是最让他担忧的。现在我担心的是，这些领导层还是在从意识形态中寻求灵感，而没有真的面对中国经济陷入停滞面临的新的问题，拿出一种勇气和魄力来。那么罗辑先生的这一篇文章啊，可以说对于自己是一个澄清，对于自己啊也有很多的反思。当然，对于媒体非黑即白的报道啊，也有一些抱怨。那我想请问一下和平先生啊，他的观点你是不是同意？中国领导层、中国经济决策层现在是不是的确拿出的方案让你觉得还是缺乏新意和想象力？
我觉得罗辑先生批评中国领导人对这个经济的问题采取的这种缺乏想象力的批评呢，实际上是证明了他对中国的经济缺乏想象力。就是他还是看到了表面，看到了现在的僵化的官场，看到了这个意识形态。但是事实上几十年来，中共这种相当僵化的意识形态没有根本上改变，从来就没有真正给大家一个开放的一个思想上的一个领域里面是开放的，包括在邓小平时代，对吧？邓小平时候是出现了一些混乱，但是他不断的来进行打击，对吧？反自由化、清除精神污染，尤其是1989年还采取了6·4的这个镇压。那么到了江泽民时候、朱镕基时候，那种改革的幅度之大，那民众的抗议也非常非常之多，那比今天呈现的情况要严重很多很多。那个时候基本上看不到中国的经济前景，因为所谓的这种下岗工人根本找不到出路，社会安全网、社会保障体系就没有出现。然后在农村在城市就出现各种各样的土地纠纷。抗议的数字有一个数字基本上具有一定规模性的抗议事情是一年好像有8万多起，那你算一算每天有多少起？大家都在唱衰中国6·4之后，你看看全世界的媒体基本上都是讲异议人士的故事，讲他们遭到迫害，讲他们对中国未来的接触一党专政等等等等，然后就讲到中国的经济的混乱，包括邓小平的南巡之后，也没有多少媒体说中国的希望就来了。突然有一天楼房起来了，突然有一天中国的经济面貌出现变化了，那个时候西方的媒体说中国出现了经济泡沫。出现了经济泡沫。实际上，西方媒体或者是西方的学者很少真正承认过中国的经济成就，只是说今天要批评习近平了，要批评中国的经济了，说原来经济不错现在我们要批评了你去看看几十年的媒体，大概是这么一种状况。所以这就使你呢对这个媒体这种铺天盖地的报道和分析就开始产生疑问。你打开西方媒体关于中国的经济，其实都是重复的话，都是从房地产的危机这个债务的危机这个老百姓的这种躺平，这些东西都是事实，或者说都是现象。但是这些事情是不是足够把中国的经济给彻底摧毁？甚至我看澳大利亚的 ABC 还说，中国的经济现在就是在解体之中那有的人就是从此以后就跟日本一样的，有的人就是说日本已经很不错了，中国会比日本更差，因为日本已经是完成了它的工业化，中国还没有完成工业化。那么实际上对中国之所以缺乏想象力，就是中国的发展成了就是在矛盾中发展的。这种矛盾就包括它自我意识形态的矛盾、体制的矛盾一直在这个中间，没有一天说在胡锦涛时候就非常开明，在江泽民时候就非常开明。江泽民上台是要把资本家搞过倾家荡产的，江泽民上台之后强调的是讲政治的，没有说不讲政治跟习近平现在讲不准妄议中央没有本质上的差别很多的左的或者今天不能接受的东西，在胡锦涛时候就有了。所以，如果你对这些事情缺乏一个基本的掌握的话，你很容易把昨天浪漫化，把今天呢变得海洋化这主要的原因就是罗辑教授所讲的缺乏想象力。
好，谢谢何明先生的点评啊。那我们说中国的这个经济是不是真的政策工具箱就空了？其实啊，在专业人士看来，这个政策工具箱非但没有空，其实工具还很足。这呢，就是来自瑞银首席王涛女士，之前我们也为大家介绍到她的观点啊，在《金融时报》的一篇观点文章，她就讲啊，说现在在政策层面上，至少工具箱里还有2大组合拳可以使用，什么呢？就是短期的宏观政策，还有中期的一些结构性政策。这呢，对于稳定房地产市场，对于恢复信心，防止金融体系出现溢出效应，其实呢都是至关重要的。现在更加需要的是什么呢？是一个更加协调的，由中央政府可以强力主导的、有序的这样的一个政策推进和落实的这样的一个过程。不是说政策箱里的工具已经空了，是有工具，但是在使用这些工具的时候要有配合、有序，以一个整体的方式来进行。王涛女士啊，也给中国的经济不但呢是开了处方，也开了怎样继续救中国经济形势这样的一个路线图。那我们听一听王涛女士的看法。首先呢，她讲到的是，第一就是地方债务的重组工作。地方债务呢，现在是挖清问题已经挖得差不多了，但是接下来要怎样进行债务的置换，到底哪一些是脆弱点，需要继续进行，需要中央政府主导协调，防止地方债务对于经济下行进行进一步的损害。第二呢，就是有关于房地产问题，要进一步逐步的放宽超大城市的购房限制，进一步逐步的降低抵押贷款利率，还有最低首付房。同时啊，300万以上人口城市的户口需求，如果能够边际放宽的话，对于提振住房需求都是有好处的。所以一定要逐步有序的来进行。还有啊，我们说的鼓励国内消费，到底怎么鼓励国内消费呢？首先可以是，你不愿意直接发消费券，之前我们也说了，你发万亿消费券有什么用啊？中国10几亿人，每个人手里几百块钱、几十块钱根本就不够。他认为啊，根本意义上增加家庭消费的这个措施可能是增加社会支出，资助一些基本的公共服务和医疗，这样呢可以让大家降低一些预防性的储蓄，有更多的资源投入到消费上来。而对于企业来说，进一步进行利率的降低，注入一些流动性，对于现在呀有很多抵押贷款的企业债务负担可能是某一种缓释。同时对于信贷系统的这样的一个宽松化，也可以对于信贷需求起到提振的作用。当然我们说现在美国利率上升了，人民币贬值的压力增大，中国当局啊在放松货币政策方面有审慎观望的态度，这似乎啊也是让人觉得有情可原的。但是他认为呢，在这样的一个层面下，降息的好处可能会超过略微扩大美中利率差的负面影响，短期内降息仍然是救经济的重要手段之一。当然他说啊，说中国即使是进行宏观刺激，也不会再回到过去这种持续增长的态势了。成功转型到新的增长模式，需要进行真正意义上的中期结构性改革。但是有一个误区是什么呢？不是说要进行中期的改革，短期的这些刺激就完全不用了，短期提振信息也很重要。北京不是不愿意直接补贴消费吗？那你可以在 GDP 的支出结构上增加医疗方面的支出，增加有关于家庭消费的长期的注入，比如说消费升级，比如跟消费相关的物流网的部署、消费基础设施等等等等。同时深化户口制度改革已经谈了几十年，不如就趁现在这样一个机会把它落实下去，增加劳动力的流动性，增加农村的这些农民工对于公共服务的获取。一旦他有了基本的医疗以及公共服务的保障，他们的消费能力和住房需求就自然提上去了，而不是靠你发消费券这样的方式。在地方政府方面，我们看到了之前的地方债务有问题，依靠房地产融资这种形式是导致中国今天债务的根本的决策失误。但是国有资产、国企货币化 找到长期可以支出的可持续融资，甚至包括基础设施本身与债务重组两边一起执行，再加上一个比较宽松的，同时也透明的监管环境，更好的投资者法律保护，更低的私营部门的准入门槛，也会对于扭转地方政府的债务形势有根本的影响。因此他说中国政府实际上并不是说没有扭转当前经济下行的工具，但是必须要看到的是什么呢？不是说为了解决长期的问题，短期你就什么都不做了，也不是说把所有的精力、所有的工具都一下子使出去，再把泡沫吹大，以此来推迟进一步进行结构性改革的难度，一定要两方面都结合起来使用，这样你的工具箱仍然是满的。成功既取决于及时行动，也取决于各个层面的政策协调，更取决于政治意愿。有关于王涛女士的这个观点，当然我们说比较的枯燥无味，没有什么惊人而论，但是在我看来呢，实际上是相当平和中正的这样的一种看法。何明先生怎么看？
中国的经济问题的解决正好就是这个思路它必须是平庸化。为什么是平庸化呢？如果你要是迎合老百姓，或者是迎合这个民意迎合媒体搞一些惊天动地的动作出来，会对经济有没有刺激作用呢？当然可以有。我们用一个最原始的方式，在去年前年就讲过了，挖一个坑就可以了。对吧？那大家就填坑，你要填完坑以后再把它挖掉又填坑，这就造成了经济的活力。但是问题是，这种方式呢，就跟在过去几年所试图对的经济的固然的打压，就正好是背道而驰，正好是白做了，对吧？过去这些经济之所以温度下降，就是因为个人的经济里面暴露的问题非常之多所以呢，重新把经济刺激起来这个不是它的主要目的。但是经济不能死掉对吧？那怎么办呢？所以实际上呢，这给中国的变革带来了一个巨大的机会。这种机会就是说呢，把某一些制度性的一些障碍，趁此机会就改了对吧？就像股市一样的，你原来这样的问题那样的问题，你没有一个股票下跌，你就意识不到，或者说即算是意识到了，你也没有动力去改变，因为股票还可以嘛。等到股票跌到2700点、2600点，逼上2500点的时候，我当时提出一个口号，跌给你习近平看，习近平就开始动作了，对吧？那中国的经济到了这样一种地步，如果你不能采取大规模的这个大水漫灌的方式的话呢，你就会要想一想怎么去集合它。集合它的方式就是把原来的制度性的障碍给拿掉，不仅是对农民的不公平的制度要改变，那原来的强加给市场上的某一些干预性的措施也可以拿掉比如说香港之所以有一些这个疯狂的这些税，当时就是为了来阻止这个房地产雇人就给了很多的条件，结果呢，房地产那个时候是得到了控制，当时的政策也可能是对的。到了后来经济过冷了，连续9个月下跌，那你这个时候就要开始把原来加热的这个政策给拿掉，一拿掉，香港的房地产马上就热起来了，而且热起来买房子的人很多是年轻人，原来是没有能力去买的，对吧？你现在一下子降掉了，等于从政府的角度来就少了30%还是左右的这个东西。你比如说中国的一线城市那种不公平的因为一线城市你给了它一些限制的措施，如果你稍微调整一下，马上就会产生变化。中国的工具当然是非常之多，大国的工具都有。就是说你在利用它的时候，最怕的就是呢走极端，如果一旦走极端，你前面就泡汤了。我们在看南美的政策，为什么会南美陷阱？原来我就是没有去南美之前，还是比较多的看资料，看多了以后，你就给你的感觉主要是经济问题。后来才发现是极端问题，无论是经济的极端政策还是政治的极端政策，造成了就是说你前面极端，你就通过另外一个极端手段来纠正它，然后就掉入了另外一个陷阱。其实中国的经济的调整这一次就是说华为平庸 但是它可能是有用的，可能是比较负责任的，这就是专制政权或者是共产党统治它的一个好处，它不需要去拿到选票它的政治是相当长时间是稳定的，所以我就说嘛，那个习近平大概稳定10年、5年甚至20年，可能都没有什么太大的问题，这就给中国存在的这些经济上的人为的政策清除或者是找到比较好的方式，一个最好的机会。如果中国有一天真正走向自由和民主了，很多的变动就会变得非常难。
好，谢谢何明先生的点评当然，我们说中国最近经济遇到的挑战，当然有中国长期所积累的问题。现在还有一个非常大的挑战，就是美国对于中国高科技的封锁和制约
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食。让您的生活品质全线升级，6度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择6度万事。我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择，然后就可以与6博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让6博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与6博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world 尝试吧。
The time when you first left. You joined LSI Logic, and that was one of the most exciting companies at the time. You're building a phenomenal reputation with some of the biggest names in tech, and yet you decide to leave to become a founder. What motivated you?
Chris and Curtis. Chris and Curtis, I was an engineer at LSI Logic, and Chris and Curtis were at Sun. And I was working with some of the brightest minds in computer science at the time, of all time, including Andy Bechtolsheim and others, building workstations and graphics workstations and so on and so forth. And Chris and Curtis said one day that they like to leave Sun, and they like me to go figure out what they're going to go leave for. And I had a great job, but they insisted that I figure out, with them how to build a company. And so we hung out at Denny's whenever they dropped by, and which is, by the way, my alma mater, my first company. My first job before CEO was a dishwasher, and I did that very well. And so anyways, we got together and we decided, and it was during the microprocessor revolution. This is 1993, and 1992 when we were getting together. The PC revolution was just getting going. You know that Windows 95, obviously, which is the revolutionary version of Windows, didn't even come to the market yet, and Pentium wasn't even announced yet. And this is all right before the PC revolution, and it was pretty clear that the microprocessor was going to be very important. And we thought, why don't we build a company to go solve problems that a normal computer that is powered by general purpose computing can't. And so that became the company's mission, to go build a computer, the type of computers, and solve problems that normal computers can't. And to this day, we're focused on that. And if you look at all the problems that in the markets that we opened up as a result, it's things like computational drug design, weather simulation, materials design. These are all things that we're really, really proud of. Robotics, self-driving cars, autonomous software we call artificial intelligence, and then of course, we drove the technology so hard that eventually the computational cost went to approximately zero, and it enabled enabled a whole new way of developing software, where the computer wrote the software itself, artificial intelligence as we know it today. And so that was it. That was the journey.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Well, these applications are on all of our minds today. But back then, the CEO of LSI Logic convinced his biggest investor, Don Valentine, to meet with you. He is obviously the founder of Sequoia.
Yeah.
Now I can see a lot of founders here edging forward in anticipation. But how did you convince the most sought-after investor in Silicon Valley to invest in a team of first-time founders building a new product for a market that doesn't even exist?
I didn't know how to write a business plan, so I went to a bookstore, and back then there were bookstores, and in the business book section there was this book, and it was written by somebody I knew, Gordon Bell, and this book, I should go find it again, but it's a very large book, and the book says How to Write a Business Plan, and that was a highly specific title for a very niche market, and it seems like he wrote it for 14 people, and I was one of them. And so I bought the book. I should have known right away that it was a bad idea, because Gordon is super smart, and super smart people have a lot to say, and they want to, and I'm pretty sure Gordon wants to teach me how to write a business plan completely. And so I picked up this book. It's like 450 pages long. Well, I never got through it, not even close. I flipped through it a few pages, and I go, you know what? By the time I'm done reading this thing, I'll be out of business. I'll be out of money. And Lori and I only had about 6 months in the bank. We had already Spencer and Madison and a dog, and so the 5 of us had to live off of whatever money we had in the bank, and so I didn't have much time. And so instead of writing the business plan, I just went to talk to Wilf Corrigan. He called me one day and said, hey, you left the company, you didn't even tell me what you were doing. I want you to come back and explain it to me. And so I went back and I explained it to Wilf. And Wilf at the end of it, he said, I have no idea what you said. And that's one of the worst elevator pitches I've ever heard. And then he picked up the phone and he called Don Valentine. And he called Don and he says, Don, I'm going to send a kid over. I want you to give him money. He's one of the best employees LSI Logic ever had. And so the thing I learned is you can make up a great interview. You could even have a bad interview, but you can't run away from your past. And so have a good past. Try to have a good past. And in a lot of ways, I was serious when I said I was a good dishwasher. I was probably Denny's best dishwasher. I planned my work. I was organized. I was mise en place. And then I washed the living daylights out of the dishes. And then they promoted me to busboy. I was certain I'm the best busboy Denny's ever had. I never left the station empty-handed. I never came back empty-handed. I was very efficient. And then so anyways, eventually I became, a CEO. I'm still working on being a good CEO. But
you talk about being the best. You needed to be the best among 89 other companies that were funded after you to build the same thing. And then with 6 to 9 months of runway left, you realized that the initial vision was just not going to work. Mm-hmm. How did you decide what to do next to save the company when the cards were so stacked against you?
Well, we started this company called For Accelerated Computing, and the question is, what is it for? What's the killer app? And that came our first great decision. And this is what Sequoia funded. The first great decision was the first killer app was going to be 3D graphics. And the technology was going to be 3D graphics. And the application was going to be video games. At the time, 3D graphics was impossible to make cheap. It was $1 million image generators from Silicon Graphics. And so it was $1 million, and it's hard to make cheap. And the video game market was $0 billion. So you have this incredible technology that's hard to commoditize and commercialize. And then you have this market that doesn't exist. That intersection was the founding of our company. And I still remember when Don, at the end of my presentation, Don was still kind of, he said, one of the things he said to me, which made a lot of sense back then, it makes a lot of sense today. He says, startups don't invest in startups, or startups don't partner with startups. And his point is that in order for NVIDIA to succeed, we needed another startup to succeed. And that other startup was Electronic Arts. And then on the way out, he reminded me that Electronic Arts' CTO is 14 years old and had to be driven to work by his mom. And he just wanted to remind me that that's who I'm relying on. And then after that, he said, if you lose my money, I'll kill you. And that was kind of my memories of that first meeting. But nonetheless, we created something. We went on the next several years to go create the market, to create the gaming market for PCs. And it took a long time to do so. We're still doing it today. We realized that not only do you have to create the technology and invent a new way of doing computer graphics so that what was $1 million is now, $300, $400, $500 that fits in a computer. And you have to go create this new market. So we have to create technology, create markets. The idea that a company would create technology, create markets defines NVIDIA today. Almost everything we do, we create technology, we create markets. That's the reason why people say we have people call it a stack, an ecosystem, words like that. But that's basically it. At the core, for 30 years, what NVIDIA realized we had to do is in order to create the conditions by which somebody could buy our products, we had to go invent this new market. And it's the reason why we were early in autonomous driving. It was the reason why we're early in deep learning. It was the reason why we're early in just about all these things, including computational drug design and discovery. All these different areas, we're trying to create the market while we're creating the technology. And so that's okay. And then we got going, and then Microsoft introduced a standard called Direct3D, and that spawned off hundreds of companies. And we found ourselves a couple of years later competing with just about everybody. And the thing that we invented, the technology we invented 3D graphics with, the consumerized 3D with, turns out to be incompatible with Direct3D. So we started this company, we had this 3D graphics thing, $1 million thing, we're trying to make it consumerized. And so we invented all this technology. And then shortly after, it became incompatible. And so we had to reset the company or go out of business. But we didn't know how to build it the way that Microsoft had defined it. And I remember a meeting at on a weekend, and the conversation was, we now have 89 competitors. I understand that the way we do it is not right, but we don't know how to do it the right way. And thankfully, there was another bookstore, and the bookstore is called Fry's Electronics. I don't know if it's still here. And so I think I drove Madison, my daughter, on a weekend to Fry's, and it was sitting right there, the OpenGL manual, which would define how Silicon Graphics did computer graphics. And so it was right there. It was like $68 a book. And so I had a couple $100. I bought 3 books. I took it back to the office and I said, guys, I found it, our future. And I handed out, I had 3 versions of it, handed out. Had a big, nice centerfold. The centerfold is the OpenGL pipeline, which is the computer graphics pipeline. And I handed it to the same geniuses that I founded the company with. And we implemented the OpenGL pipeline like nobody had ever implemented the OpenGL pipeline, and we built something the world never seen. And so a lot of lessons are right there. That moment in time for our company gave us so much confidence. And the reason for that is you can succeed in doing something, inventing a future, even if you were not informed about it at all. And it's kind of my attitude about everything now. When somebody tells me about something and I've never heard of it before, or if I've heard of it, don't understand how it works at all, my first thought is always, how hard can it be? And it's probably just a textbook away. You're probably one archive paper away from figuring this out. And so I spent a lot of time reading archive papers, and it's true. It's true. You can now, of course, you can't learn how somebody else does something and do it exactly the same way and hope to have a different outcome. But you could learn how something can be done, and then go back to first principles and ask yourself, given the conditions today, given my motivation, given the instruments, the tools, given how things have changed, how would I redo this? How would I reinvent this whole thing? How would I design it? How would I build a car today? Would I build it incrementally from 1950s and 1900s? How would I build a computer today? How would I write software today? Does it make sense? And so I go back to first principles all the time, even in the company today, and just reset ourselves. Because the world has changed. And the way we wrote software in the past was monolithic, and it's designed for supercomputers, but now it's disaggregated, it's, so on and so forth. And how we think about software today, how we think about computers today, just always cause your company, always cause yourself to go back to first principles, and it creates lots and lots of opportunities.
Yeah, the way you applied this technology turns to be revolutionary. You get all the momentum that you need to IPO, and then some more, because you grow your revenue 9 times in the next 4 years. But in the middle of all of this success, you decide to pivot a little bit the focus of innovation happening at NVIDIA based on a phone call you have with this chemistry professor. Can you tell us about that phone call and how you connected the dots from what you heard to where you went?
Remember, at the core, the company was pioneering a new way of doing computing. Computer graphics was the first application. But we always knew that there would be other applications. And so image processing came, particle physics came, fluids came, so on and so forth. All kinds of interesting things that we wanted to do. We made the processor more programmable so that we could express more algorithms, if you will. And then one day we invented programmable shaders, which made all forms of imaging and computer graphics programmable. That was a great breakthrough, so we invented that. On top of that, we invented, we tried to look for ways to express more sophisticated algorithms that could be computed on our processor, which is very different than a CPU. And so we created this thing called CG. So I think it was 2003 or so. C for GPUs. It predated CUDA by about 3 years. The same person who wrote the textbook that saved the company, Mark Kilgard, wrote that textbook. And so CG was super cool. We wrote textbooks about it. We started teaching people how to use it. We developed tools and such. And then several researchers discovered it. Many of the researchers here, students here at Stanford, was using it. Many of the engineers that then became engineers at NVIDIA were playing with it. A couple of doctors at Mass General picked it up and used it for CT reconstruction. So I flew out and saw them and said, what are you guys doing with this thing? And they told me about that. And then a computational, a quantum chemist used it to express his algorithms. And so I realized that there's some evidence that people might want to use this, and it gave us incrementally more confidence that we ought to go do this, that this field, this form of computing, could solve problems that normal computers really can't, and reinforced our belief and kept us going.
Every time you heard something new, you really savored that surprise. And that seems to be a theme throughout your leadership at NVIDIA. It feels like you make these bets so far in advance of technology inflections that when the apple finally falls from the tree, you're standing right there in your black leather jacket waiting to catch it. How do you find the conviction?
Always seems like a diving catch. Always does seem like a diving catch. You do things based on core beliefs. You know, we deeply believe that we could create a computer that solves problems normal processing can't do. That there are limits to what a CPU can do. There are limits to what general purpose computing can do. And then there are interesting problems that we can go solve. The question is always, are those interesting problems only, or can they also be interesting markets? Because if they're not interesting markets, it's not sustainable. And NVIDIA went through about a decade where we were investing in this future and the markets didn't exist. There was only one market at the time, it was computer graphics. For 10, 15 years, the markets that fuels NVIDIA today just didn't exist. And so how do you continue with all of the people around you, our company and NVIDIA's management team and all of the amazing engineers that are there creating this future with me, all of your shareholders, your board of directors, all your partners, you're taking everybody with you, and there's no evidence of a market. That is really, really challenging. The fact that the technology can solve problems and the fact that you have research papers that are used, that are made possible because of it are interesting, but you're always looking for that market. But nonetheless, before a market exists, you still need early indicators of future success. We have this phrase in the company there's a phrase called key performance indicators. Unfortunately, KPIs are hard to understand. I find KPIs hard to understand. What's a good KPI? A lot of people, when we look for KPIs, you go, gross margins. That's not a KPI. That's a result. You're looking for something that's an early indicators of future positive results, okay? And as early as possible. And the reason for that is because you want that early sign that you're going in the right direction. And so we have this phrase, it's called EOIFS, early indicators, EIOFS, early indicators of future success. And it helps people, because I was using it all the time, to give the company hope that, hey, look, we solved this problem, we solved that problem, we solved this problem. The markets didn't exist, but there were important problems. And that's what the company's about, to solve these problems. We want to be sustainable, and therefore the markets have to exist at some point. But you want to decouple the result from evidence that you're doing the right thing. Okay, and so that's how you kind of solve this problem of investing into something that's very, very far away, and having the conviction to stay on the road is to find as early as possible the indicators that you're doing the right things. And so start with a core belief. Unless something changes your mind, you continue to believe in it, and look for early indicators of future success.
What are some of those early indicators that have been used by product teams at NVIDIA?
All kinds. I saw a paper. Long before I saw the paper, I met some people that needed my help on this thing called deep learning. At the time, I didn't even know what deep learning was, and they needed us to create a domain-specific language so that all of their algorithms could be expressed easily on our processors. And we created this thing called cuDNN, and it's essentially the SQL. SQL is in storage computing. This is neural network computing, and we created a language, if you will, domain-specific language for that. Kind of like the OpenGL of deep learning. And so they needed us to do that so that they could express their mathematics. And they didn't understand CUDA, but they understood their deep learning. And so we created this thing in the middle for them. And the reason why we did it was because even though there were zero, these researchers had no money. And this is kind of one of the great skills of our company, that you're willing to do something even though the financial returns are completely non-existent, or maybe very, very far out, even if you believed in it. We ask ourselves, is this worthy work to do? Does this advance a field of science somewhere that matters? Notice, this is something that I've been talking about, since the very beginning of time. We find inspiration not from the size of a market, but from the importance of the work. Because the importance of the work is the early indicators of a future market. And nobody has to do a business case on it. Nobody has to show me a P&L. Nobody has to show me a financial forecast. The only question is this important work? And if we didn't do it, would it happen without us? Now, if we didn't do something and something could happen without us, it gives me tremendous joy, actually. And the reason for that is, could you imagine the world got better, you didn't have to lift a finger? That's the definition of, ultimate laziness. And in a lot of ways, you want that habit. And the reason for that is this. You want the company to be lazy about doing things that other people always can do. If somebody else can do it, let them do it. We should go select the things that if we didn't do it, the world would fall apart. You have to convince yourself of that. That if I don't do this, it won't get done. That is, and if that work is hard and that work is impactful and important, then it gives you a sense of purpose. Does that make sense? And so our company has been selecting these projects. Deep learning was just one of them. And the first indicator of the success of that was this, fuzzy cat that Andrew Ng came up with. And then Alex Kershevsky detected cats, not all the time, but successfully enough that it was, this might take us somewhere. And we reasoned about the structure of deep learning, and we're computer scientists and we understand how things work. And so we convinced ourselves this could change everything. And anyhow, but that's an example.
So these selections that you've made, they've paid huge dividends, both literally and figuratively. But you've had to steer the company through some very challenging times, like when it lost 80% of its market cap amid the financial crisis because Wall Street didn't believe in your bet on ML. In times like these, how do you steer the company and keep the employees motivated at the task at hand? My reaction during that time is the same reaction I had about this week. Earlier today, you asked me about this week. My pulse was exactly the same. This week is no different than last week or the week before that. And so the opposite of that, when you drop 80%, don't get me wrong. When your share price drops 80%, it's a little embarrassing, okay? And you just want to wear a T-shirt that says "wasn't my fault." But even more than that, you just don't want to get out of your bed. You don't want to leave the house. All of that is true. All of that is true. But then you go back to just doing your job. I woke up at the same time, prioritized my day in the same way. I go back to what do I believe? You got to gut check, always gut check back to the core. What do you believe? What are the most important things? And just check them off. Sometimes it's helpful to, family loves me. Okay, check. Double check. Right? And so you just got to check it off, and you go back to your core, and then go back to work. And then every conversations go back to the core. Keep the company focused back on the core. Do you believe in it? Did something change? The stock price changed, but did something else change? Did physics change? Did gravity change? Did all of the things that we assumed, that we believed, that led to our decision, did any of those things change? Because if those things change, you got to change everything. But if none of those things change, you change nothing. Keep on going. Yeah. That's how you do it. In speaking with your employees, they say that
and try to avoid the public.
In speaking with your employees, they've said that your leadership,
including the employees. I'm just kidding. No, leaders have to be seen. Unfortunately, that's the hard part. I was an electrical engineering student, and I was quite young when I went to school. When I went to college, I was still 16 years old, and so I was young when I did everything. And so I was a bit of an introvert. I'm kind of, I'm shy. I don't enjoy public speaking. I'm delighted to be here. I'm not suggesting, but it's not something that I do naturally. And so when things are challenging, it's not easy to be in front of precisely the people that you care most about. And the reason for that is because, could you imagine a company meeting our stock price just dropped by 80%? And the most important thing I have to do as the CEO is this: to come and face you, explain it. And partly you're not sure why, partly you're not sure how long, how bad. You just don't know these things. But you still gotta explain it. Face all these people, and you know what they're thinking. Some of them are probably thinking we're doomed. Some people are probably thinking you're an idiot, and some people are probably thinking something else. And so there are a lot of things that people are thinking, and you know that they're thinking those things, but you still have to get in front of them and deal, do the hard work.
They may be thinking of those things, but yet not a single person of your leadership team left during times like this. And in fact,
they're unemployable. That's what I keep reminding them. I'm just kidding. I'm surrounded by geniuses. Yeah, other geniuses, unbelievable. NVIDIA is well known to have singularly the best management team on the planet. This is the deepest technology management team the world's ever seen. I'm surrounded by a whole bunch of them, and they're just geniuses. Business teams, marketing teams, sales teams, just incredible. Engineering teams, research teams, unbelievable. Yeah.
Your employees say that your leadership style is very engaged. You have 50 direct reports. You encourage people across all parts of the organization to send you the top 5 things on their mind, and you constantly remind people that no task is beneath you. Can you tell us why you've purposefully designed such a flat organization, and how should we be thinking about our organizations that we design in the future?
No task is to me, no task is beneath me, because remember, I used to be a dishwasher, and I mean that. I used to clean toilets. I mean, I cleaned a lot of toilets. I've cleaned more toilets than all of you combined. and some of them just can't unsee. I don't know what to tell you. That's life. And so you can't show me a task that's beneath me. Now I'm not doing it only because of whether it's beneath me or not beneath me. If you send me something and you want my input on it, and I can be of service to you, and in my review of it, share with you how I reasoned through it, I've made a contribution to you. I've made it possible for you to see how I reason through something, and by reasoning, as you know, how someone reasons through something empowers you. You go, oh my gosh, that's how you reason through something like this. It's not as complicated as it seems. This is how you reason through something that's super ambiguous. This is how you reason through something that's incalculable. This is how you reason through something that seems to be very scary. This is how you seem, do you understand? And so I show people how to reason through things all the time. Strategy things, how to forecast something, how to break a problem down, and you're empowering people all over the place. And so that's how I see it. If you send me something, you want me to help review it, I'll do my best, and I'll show you how I would do it. In the process of doing that, of course, I learned a lot from you. Is that right? You gave me a seed of a lot of information. I learned a lot. And so I feel rewarded by the process. It does take a lot of energy sometimes, because you got, in order to add value to somebody, and they're incredibly smart as a starting point, and I'm surrounded by incredibly smart people, you have to at least get to their plane, you have to get into their headspace. And that's really hard. That's really hard. And that takes just an enormous amount of emotional and intellectual energy. And so I feel exhausted after I work on things like that. I'm surrounded by a lot of great people. A CEO should have the most direct reports by definition, because the people that reports to the CEO requires the least amount of management. It makes no sense to me that CEOs have so few people reporting to them, except for one fact that I know to be true. The knowledge, the information of a CEO is supposedly so valuable, so secretive, you can only share it with 2 other people, or 3. And their information is so invaluable, so incredibly secretive, that they can only share it with a couple more. Well, I don't believe in a culture, an environment where the information that you possess is the reason why you have power. I would like us all to contribute to the company, and our position in the company should have something to do with our ability to reason through complicated things, lead other people to achieve greatness, inspire, empower other people, support other people. Those are the reasons why the management team exists, in service of all of the other people that work in the company, to create the conditions by which all of these amazing people volunteer to come work for you instead of all the other amazing high-tech companies around the world. They volunteer to work for you. And so you should create the conditions by which they could do their life's work, which is my mission. You probably heard it. I've said that, pretty clearly, and I believe that. What my job is very simply to create the conditions by which you could do your life's work. And so how do I do that? What does that condition look like? Well, that condition should result in a great deal of empowerment. You can only be empowered if you understand the circumstance, isn't that right? You have to understand the context of the situation you're in order for you to come up with great ideas. And so I have to create a circumstance where you understand the context, which means you have to be informed. And the best way to be informed is for there to be as little layers of information mutilation, right, between us. And so that's the reason why it's very often that I'm reasoning through things like in an audience like this. I say, first of all, this is the beginning facts. These are the data that we have. This is how I would reason through it. These are some of the assumptions. These are some of the unknowns. These are some of the knowns. And so you reason through it. And now you've created an organization that's highly empowered. NVIDIA has 30,000 people. We're the smallest large company in the world. We're a tiny little company. But every employee is so empowered, and they're making smart decisions on my behalf every single day. And the reason for that is because, they understand my condition. They understand my condition. I'm very transparent with people. And I believe that I can trust you with the information. Oftentimes the information is hard to hear, and the situations are complicated, but I trust that you can handle it. A lot of people hear me say, you're adults here. You can handle this. Sometimes they're not really adults. They just graduated. I'm just kidding. I know that when I first graduated, I was barely an adult. And but I was fortunate that I was trusted with important information. So I want to do that. I want to create the conditions for people to do that.
Okay. I do want to now address the topic that is on everybody's mind, AI. Last week, you said that generative AI and accelerated computing have hit the tipping point. So as this technology becomes more mainstream, what are the applications that you personally are most excited about?
Well, you have to go back to first principles and ask yourself, what is generative AI? What happened? What happened was we now have the ability to have software that can understand something. They can understand why, what is, first of all, we digitized everything. That was, like, for example, gene sequencing. You digitize genes. But what does it mean? That sequence of genes, what does it mean? We've digitized amino acids. But what does it mean? And so we now have the ability, we digitize words, we digitize sounds, we digitize images, videos, we digitize a lot of things. But what does it mean? We now have the ability through a lot of studying, a lot of data and from the patterns and relationships, we now understand what they mean. Not only do we understand what they mean, we can translate between them. Because we learned about the meaning of these things in the same world. We didn't learn about them separately. So we learned about speech and words and paragraphs and vocabulary in the same context. And so we found correlations between them, and they're all, registered, if you will, registered to each other. And so now we, not only do we understand the modality, the meaning of each modality, we can understand how to translate between them. And so for obvious things, you could caption video to text, that's captioning, text to images, Midjourney, text to text, ChatGPT, amazing things. And so we now know that we understand meaning and we can translate. The translation of something is generation of information, and all of a sudden you have to take a step back and ask yourself, what is the implication in every single layer of everything that we do? And so I'm exercising in front of you, I'm reasoning in front of you, the same thing I did 15 years ago when I first saw AlexNet, some 13, 14 years ago, I guess, how I reasoned through it. What did I see? How interesting? What can it do? Very cool. But then most importantly, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean to every single layer of computing? Because we're in the world of computing. And so what it means is that the way that we process information fundamentally will be different in the future. That's what NVIDIA builds, chips and systems. The way we write software will be fundamentally different in the future. The type of software we'll be able to write in the future will be different, new applications. And then also the processing of those applications will be different. What was historically a retrieval-based model where information was pre-recorded, if you will, almost. We wrote the text, pre-recorded, and we retrieved it based on some recommender system algorithm. In the future, some seed of information will be the starting point. We call them prompts, as you guys know. And then we generate the rest of it. And so the future of computing will be highly generated. Well, let me give you an example of what's happening. For example, we're having a conversation right now. Very little of the information I'm conveying to you is retrieved. Most of it is generated. It's called intelligence. And so in the future, we're going to have a lot more generative. Our computers will perform in that way. It's going to be highly generative instead of highly retrieval based. Then you go back and you got to ask yourself, now for entrepreneurs, you got to ask yourself, what industries will be disrupted? Therefore, will we think about networking the same way? Will we think about storage the same way? Would we be as abusive of internet traffic as we are today? Probably not. Notice we're having a conversation right now, and I don't have to get in my car every question. So we don't have to be as abusive of transformation, information transporting as we used to. What's going to be more? What's going to be less? What kind of applications? Et cetera, et cetera. So you can go through the entire industrial spread and ask yourself what's going to get disrupted, what's going to be different, what's going to get nude, so on and so forth. And that reasoning starts from what is happening. What is generative AI? Foundationally, what is happening? Go back to first principles with all things. There was something I was going to tell you about organization. You asked the question, and I forgot to answer it. The way you create an organization, by the way, someday, don't worry about how other companies' org charts look. You start from first principles. Remember what an organization is designed to do. The organizations of the past where there's a king, CEO, and then you have all these, the royal subjects, the royal court, and then e-staff. And then you keep working your way down. Eventually, they're employees. Well, the reason why it was designed that way is because they wanted the employees to have as little information as possible because their fundamental purpose of the soldiers is to die in the field of battle. To die without asking questions. You guys know this. I only have 30,000 employees. I would like none of them to die. I would like them to question everything. Does that make sense? And so the way you organize in the past and the way you organize today is very different. Second, the question is what does NVIDIA build? An organization is designed so that we could build whatever it is we build better. And so if we all build different things, why are we organized the same way? Why would this organizational machinery be exactly the same, irrespective of what you build? It doesn't make any sense. You build computers, you organize this way. You build healthcare services, you're built exactly the same way. It makes no sense whatsoever. And so you have to go back to first principles. Just ask yourself, what kind of machinery? What is the input? What is the output? What are the properties of this environment? You know, what is the forest that this animal has to live in? What are its characteristics? Is it stable most of the time? You're trying to squeeze out the last drop of water? Or is it changing all the time, being attacked by everybody? And so you got to understand, you know, you're the CEO, your job is to architect this company. That's my first job, to create the conditions by which you can do your life's work. And the architecture has to be right. And so you have to go back to first principles and think about those things. And I was fortunate that when I was 29 years old, you know, I had the benefit of taking a step back and asking myself, you know, how would I build this company for the future and what would it look like? And, you know, what's the operating system, which is called culture? What kind of behavior do we encourage, enhance, and what do we discourage and not enhance? You know, so on and so forth. And anyways.
I want to save time for audience questions, but this year's theme for View from the Top is redefining tomorrow. And one question we've asked all of our guests is, Jensen, as the co-founder and CEO of NVIDIA, if you were to close your eyes and magically change one thing about tomorrow, what would it be?
Were we supposed to think about this in advance? I'm going to give you a horrible answer. I don't know that it's one thing. Look, there are a lot of things we don't control. You know, there are a lot of things we don't control. Your job is to make a unique contribution. Live a life of purpose. To do something that nobody else in the world would do or can do. To make a unique contribution. So that in the event that after you're done, everybody says, you know, the world was better because you were here. And so I think that to me, I live my life kind of like this. I go forward in time and I look backwards. So you asked me a question that's exactly from a computer vision pose perspective, exactly the opposite of how I think. I never look forward from where I am. I go forward in time and look backwards. And the reason for that is it's easier. I would look backwards and kind of read my history. We did this and we did that way and we broke that problem down. Does that make sense? And so it's a little bit like how you guys solve problems. You figure out what is the end result that you're looking for, and you work backwards to achieve it. And so I imagine NVIDIA making a unique contribution to advancing the future of computing, which is the single most important instrument of all humanity. Now, it's not about our self-importance, but this is just what we're good at. And it's incredibly hard to do. And we believe we can make an absolute unique contribution. It's taken us 31 years to be here, and we're still just beginning our journey. And so this is insanely hard to do. And when I look backwards, I believe that we're going to be remembered as a company that kind of changed everything. Not because we went out and changed everything through all the things that we said, but because we did this one thing that was insanely hard to do, that we're incredibly good at doing, that we love doing, we did for a long time.
I'm part of the GSP lead. I graduated in 2023. So my question is, how do you see your company in the next decade? As what challenges do you see your company would face and how you are positioned for that?
First of all, can I just tell you what was going on through my head? As you say, what challenges? The list that flew by my head was so large that I was trying to figure out what to select. Now, the honest truth is that when you asked that question, most of the challenges that showed up for me were technical challenges. And the reason for that is because that was my morning. If you were to, chosen yesterday, it might have been market creation challenges. There are some markets that I just desperately would love to create. Can't we just do it already? But we can't do it alone. NVIDIA is a technology platform company. We're here in service of a whole bunch of other companies so that they could realize, if you will, our hopes and dreams through them. And so some of the things that I would love for the world of biology to be at a point where it's kind of like the world of chip design 40 years ago. Computer-aided design, EDA, that entire industry, really made possible for us today. And I believe we're going to make possible for them tomorrow. Computer-aided drug design, because we're able to now represent genes and proteins and even cells now. Very, very close to be able to represent and understand the meaning of a cell. A combination of a whole bunch of genes. What does a cell mean? It's kind of like, what does that paragraph mean? Well, if we could understand a cell like we can understand a paragraph, imagine what we could do. And so I'm anxious for that to happen. You know, I'm kind of excited about that. There's some that I'm just excited about that I know we're around the corner on. For example, humanoid robotics. They're very, very close around the corner. And the reason for that is because if you can tokenize and understand speech, why can't you tokenize and understand manipulation? And so these kind of computer science techniques, once you figure something out, you ask yourself, well, if I got to do that, why can't I do that? And so I'm excited about those kind of things. And so that challenge is kind of a happy challenge. Some of the other challenges, of course, are industrial and geopolitical, and they're social, but you've heard all that stuff before. These are all true. You know, the social issues in the world, the geopolitical issues in the world. Why can't we just get along things in the world? Why do I have to say those kind of things in the world? Why do we have to say those things and then amplify them in the world? Why do we have to judge people so much in the world? You know, all those things, you guys all know that. I don't have to say those things over again.
My name's Jose. I'm a class of the 2023 from the GSB. My question is, are you worried at all about the pace at which we're developing AI? And do you believe that any sort of regulation might be needed? Thank you.
Yeah, the answer is yes and no. We need, you know that the greatest breakthrough in modern AI, of course, deep learning, and it enabled great progress. But another incredible breakthrough is something that humans know and we practice all the time, and we just invented it for language models called grounding, reinforcement learning, human feedback. I provide reinforcement learning, human feedback every day. That's my job. And for their parents in the room, you're providing reinforcement learning, human feedback all the time. Okay? Now, we just figured out how to do that at a systematic level for artificial intelligence. There are a whole bunch of other technologies necessary to guardrail, fine-tune, ground. For example, how do I generate tokens that obey the laws of physics? You know, right now things are floating in space and doing things, and they don't obey the laws of physics. That requires technology. Guardrailing requires technology. Fine-tuning requires technology. Alignment requires technology. Safety requires technology. The reason why planes are so safe is because, you know, all of the autopilot systems are surrounded by diversity and redundancy and all kinds of different functional safety and active safety systems that were invented. I need all of that to be invented much, much faster. You also know that the border between security and artificial intelligence, cybersecurity and artificial intelligence is going to become blurrier and blurrier. And we need technology to advance very, very quickly in the area of cybersecurity in order to protect us from artificial intelligence. And so in a lot of ways, we need technology to go faster, a lot faster. Okay, regulation, there's two types of regulation. There's social regulation, I don't know what to do about that. But there's product and services regulation, know exactly what to do about that. Okay, so the FAA, the FDA, the NHTSA, you name it, all the Fs and all the Ns and all the, you know, FCCs, they all have regulations for products and services that have particular use cases. Bar exams and doctors and, you know, so on and so forth. You all have qualification exams. You all have standards that you have to reach. You all have to continuously be certified. Accountants and so on and so forth. Whether it's a product or a service, there are lots and lots of regulations. please do not add a super regulation that cuts across of it. The regulator who is regulating accounting should not be the regulator that regulates a doctor. You know, I love accountants, but I just, you know, if I ever need an open heart surgery, the fact that they can close books is interesting, but not sufficient. And so I would like all of those fields that already have products and services to also enhance their regulations in the context of AI. Okay, but I left out this one very big one, which is the social implication of AI. And how do you deal with that? I don't have great answers for that, but you know, enough people are talking about it. But it's important to subdivide all of this into chunks. Does that make sense? So that we don't become super hyper focused on this one thing at the expense of a whole bunch of routine things that we could have done. And as a result, people are getting killed by cars and planes, and you know, it doesn't make any sense. We should make sure that we do the right things there. Okay, very practical things. May I take one more question?
Well, we have some rapid-fire questions for you as a view from the tradition.
Okay.
Which
I was trying to avoid that. Okay, all right, fire away, fire away.
Well, your first job was at Denny's. They now have a booth dedicated to you. What was your fondest memory of working?
My second job was AMD, by the way. Is there a booth dedicated to me there? I'm just kidding. I love my job there. I did. I loved it. It was a great company. Yeah.
If there were a worldwide shortage of black leather jackets, what would we be see you wearing?
Oh no, I've got a large reservoir of black jackets. I'll be the only person who is not concerned.
You spoke a lot about textbooks. If you had to write one, what would it be called?
I wouldn't write one. You're asking me a hypothetical question that has no possibility of
That's fair. And finally, if you could share one parting piece of advice to broadcast across Stanford, what would it be?
It's not a word, but you know, have a core belief. Gut check it every day. Pursue it with all your might. Pursue it for a very long time. Surround yourself with people you love and take them on that ride. So that's the story of NVIDIA.
We're discussing a critical aspect of China's governance. How is China handling its internal security? Outsiders know very little about the Chinese state security apparatus. How does the CCP leadership approach its internal security policies? And how does China's domestic security efforts impact Chinese foreign policy? Joining us today is Dr. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens. Dr. Greitens is associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs UT's Asia Policy Program. Her research focuses on security, authoritarian politics and foreign policy in East Asia. Currently, Dr. Greitens is on leave to serve as a visiting associate professor of research in Indo-Pacific security at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. She is also concurrently a non-resident scholar with the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you for joining us today, Sheena.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let's start by discussing what is China's national security apparatus, what organizations does it involve, and what are the primary roles and objectives?
It's a great question. So China's national security apparatus, I think of it as the system that Xi Jinping has put in place to build out, implement, move forward his vision for national security, which he laid out starting in 2014 under the framework of what he called the comprehensive national security concept, sometimes translated as comprehensive state security concept, overall national security outlook. There's probably a half dozen different ways that concept gets translated. But I really see that as the intellectual core of his way of thinking about national security. And it's also something that he's translated institutionally, legally, and in policy into a national security system within the Chinese political system that's become increasingly important over time. National security has become one of Xi Jinping's contributions and one of the signature initiatives of his 2, now 3 terms in power. That approach to national security has a couple of key features. First of all, it's very broad. So Xi Jinping started in 2014 with about 13 or 14 different components of national security, and that number is multiplied. I think we're up to almost twice that today. So over 20 different components of national security, everything from the more traditional components like homeland security, border security, things that we as Americans might associate with our national security framework, to things that are much less traditional components of security: energy security, food security, data security, economic, energy, food security, right? That cluster of issues. So the first thing to know about this concept of national security and the national security apparatus is that it has a very broad scope. And almost anything can be dealt with using the national security toolkit or players in the Chinese political system. Second, that vision of national security sees internal and external security as very closely related, but it includes a lot more internal security components than we in the American national security community might think of as part of national security. And that matters because the sort of foundation of national security in the comprehensive national security concept in Xi Jinping's intellectual framework for national security is what the CCP calls political security, which in turn is defined as the security of China's socialist system, the authority of the CCP Central Committee, and Xi Jinping is the core of that system. And so it is fundamentally a regime security concept, a security concept for the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power and its leadership, rather than the sort of national security divorced from a particular political party or leader. And so I think those are the sort of really key characteristics of the national security apparatus that Xi Jinping has constructed during his time so far in power.
Thank you, Sheena. Given what you described, 20 plus components of national security, what are the major or most important players in China's national security system?
I think the scope has broadened a bit over time as the concept has expanded, and an increasing number of actors in the Chinese political system have responsibility for national security. We see language to that effect, especially around the passage of the counter-espionage law last year, which I'm happy to come back to. But the key players are really, we're talking about what in Chinese would be called the political legal apparatus, which includes the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the court system, the procuracy, the parts of the Ministry of Justice, the folks who run prisons and policing and law enforcement. But then it also does touch on 2 other parts of the Chinese political system, the PLA and party control over the PLA, which is a key part of Xi Jinping's vision of political security, and then the disciplinary apparatus. So one of the organizational changes that Xi Jinping made that was linked back to the comprehensive national security concept was to reorganize the organizations that do discipline and supervision to create a very powerful discipline and supervision apparatus in the party state that has handled a lot of the anti-corruption campaigns and therefore has been responsible for removing and changing a lot of the personnel turnover we've seen in the military, in the security apparatus, in the Ministry of Public and State Security, and elsewhere in the party state has been because of this enhanced discipline and supervision authority that Xi Jinping has created. And so I think those are, broadly speaking, who the key players are.
And how does the Central National Security Commission fit within all of this?
So the Central National Security Commission was created in 2014 when the Comprehensive National Security concept was launched, and it's the body that is chaired by Xi Jinping that oversees national security work. It's a party body, and one of the interesting things, again, about this sort of organizational overhaul of the national security apparatus that Xi Jinping has done is that the Central National Security Commission has now been replicated at various levels of the party state down to the local level. So there's a provincial national security commission. They meet and are responsible for national security issues in their particular area, as well as things like public education around national security, which has been one of the recent priorities of Xi Jinping's national security effort, more effort put toward citizen awareness, mobilization, and public education around what national security is and how citizens are responsible for contributing to it.
Thank you, Sheena. Before delving into China's security apparatus, I think it will be useful to have a comparative perspective. How does China view national security compared to other countries, especially authoritarian countries like Russia and North Korea? What is unique or different about China's view or China's system?
I would say that the attention given to overhauling, reorganizing, and creating new national security frameworks, whether that's in organizations, law, policy, personnel, that the Chinese government and party state have really been out in front in terms of how proactive and how revisionist they've been willing to be to their own system, even compared to places like Russia and North Korea. The interesting part, though, is that I do think we see some convergence in thinking between Beijing and Moscow, or Beijing and Pyongyang. I did some work about 2 years ago where I looked at North Korea's model of basically what is called in Vietnam market Leninism, and in North Korea, or in China, among China scholars, party state capitalism. And it's this model of trying to use different tools in a Leninist political system to blend some market mechanisms in the economy with strong political control by a Leninist party. And, North Korea has, I think, increasingly moved toward the Chinese model of doing that, even as China has tightened party control and regulatory authority over certain sectors of the economy. I also think we see some convergence with places like Russia. If you look at one of the things that was new in that infamous February 2022 joint statement by China and Russia that included the no limits partnership language, that joint statement talked specifically about the shared interests that Russia and China had in combating the threat of external interference, subversion, the threat of color revolutions in their common adjacent regions, I believe was the phrasing. I would want to go back and double check, but that's broadly what the concept was. And you see, I think, that there's a shared fear about what could threaten regime security, why the United States having alliances and partnerships on the respective borders of China and Russia was considered a threat. And it wasn't just that it was an external conventional military threat. It was actually framed in the language of a threat to regime security. So again, I don't want to overstate, because these are different political systems. They operate somewhat differently. Their security sectors are organized a little bit differently. But I do think that we see some very interesting points of convergence. It's also true of somewhere like Vietnam, which is increasingly using language like prevent and control, which is one of Xi Jinping's signature phrases about his approach that I've seen in official comments by Vietnamese senior party and internal security leaders as well. So I think we are seeing some interesting shared approaches or cooperation and convergence among these powers. Again, don't want to overstate it, but it's definitely there and worth watching.
Sheena, you mentioned most of the major changes that we've seen have occurred under Xi Jinping, and you flagged 2014 as a major year of change. To what extent have we seen increased PRC threat perceptions under Xi that we didn't see in his predecessors? So in other words, how much are what we are seeing right now in China, the perceived PRC threat perception, how much of that is a result of Xi Jinping and his own worldviews?
Yeah, it's a great and really tricky question to try to answer. My read of Chinese rhetoric is that Xi Jinping saw from, around 2014, from some of his early statements, more risks to the Chinese political system and more concern than maybe previous leaders had. And again, particularly related to this sort of sense of non-traditional security and the risk that external developments could destabilize party rule at home. It seems to me that darker view of China's external and internal security environment has not gone away. He uses the phrase complicated, the most complicated environment in the CCP's history. Not necessarily the worst, right? The Long March was pretty grim, but most complicated. And what I think is really interesting and maybe counterintuitive for a lot of us who are watching China is that if you actually look at some of what Xi Jinping says, greater power does not seem to lead to greater security. It actually in some ways leads to greater risk and greater vulnerability. There's a very interesting dialectical framing of that even as the opportunities and the gains for China get better and it gets closer to accomplishing the goal of national rejuvenation, that resistance will increase, that the difficulty and the struggle will increase. It's very dialectical, but that runs a bit maybe counter to people who might look at China and say it's gained so much in power. How does that lead it to be insecure? But again, I also think we need to remember that this is about regime insecurity and not necessarily about raw national power. Raw national power doesn't always solve regime security concerns in a non-democracy. And so there are a couple of interesting factors that I think shape Xi Jinping's threat perceptions. But to be honest, we sometimes, I think, struggle to understand a bit how Chinese leaders view the evolution of the threat environment and what the pathway to security might be for them. I think the comprehensive national security concept gives us a roadmap, but that concept was pretty vague and has been put into practice bits and pieces at a time over the course of a decade. So I think it's easy to look at disparate parts of those policy changes or organizational changes and not link them back to the same fundamental underlying vision and concept of regime security. But I think it's important to try to do that because it gives us an overarching framework and a guide by which to try to understand not just what China's already done, but where it might be headed next.
Thank you, Sheena. I really like your point about how greater power does not necessarily lead to greater security. Do you have a sense of how Xi Jinping or the CCP leadership prioritizes China's national security threats? I'm not aware of any one document that authoritatively lists the threats that China faces, but is there a broad understanding of what the top threats are or a broad understanding of how the threats are prioritized?
We get a sense, I think, of what those issues are, but prioritization is in some ways a challenge with a concept that is as broad as Xi Jinping has made the comprehensive national security concept. And I think that actually creates some issues, especially for leaders, Chinese leaders or politicians at the local level who are tasked with implementing national security as well as economic growth performance metrics at this point, because it clouds the system a little bit around sort of what the objectives and the deliverables that the system is trying to incentivize are. So I actually think you've hit on one of the key issues here, which is that absent very clear prioritization and deprioritization, you're going to get this sort of gradual creeping securitization, which, there's been some internal discussion in China of maybe we should think about what the healthy or productive limits to that are. But that's a very difficult conversation to have. And there are very strong countervailing forces, I think, that are pushing toward this protection of national security that come directly from the top of the Chinese political system and from Xi Jinping himself. So I think that the creeping securitization of issues in China is largely the result of this broad conceptual framework that doesn't appear to have a lot of self-limiting mechanisms built into it.
Thank you. I understand there is no clear hierarchy of the threats that China faces, but could you walk us through some of the major challenges that Beijing has identified? A couple of items that we often hear are internal challenges like social unrest and economic inequality. And you also mentioned economic security as well as legitimacy of the CCP as top priorities. To what extent does Xi and the Chinese leadership really view themselves as significantly under threat right now?
So I think that social unrest has long been a real concern from the standpoint of political security for the CCP. I see less of a change in the underlying concern about social unrest and more adaptation in how the CCP thinks that it should address those issues. And there I would identify a couple of changes in the way the approach has evolved. First, Xi Jinping's approach is highly preventive. So we rarely hear sometimes we'll still hear the language of stability maintenance, but there was actually some discussion at one point among the internal security officials about the sort of implied that stability maintenance was too reactive. And instead, you often hear this language of prevention and control and the need to treat root causes, not just symptoms, when it comes to challenges to domestic security or to political security. So I think the first change in the approach is that it has become even more highly preventive. We see a lot of medical metaphors, particularly around the time of the mass establishment of re-education camps in Xinjiang on an expanded scale. The other thing is that that's often the justification for the use of technology. So in 2015, a year after Xi Jinping promulgated the comprehensive national security concept, the State Council and the CCP Central Committee issued a directive that included a phrase about aiming for multidimensional information-based prevention and control system for public and social security, which is kind of a mouthful and basically is a shorthand for not just the surveillance state, but the back-end platforms that take data gathered via human and technical surveillance and pull it in and try to actually make it usable in governance. So things like the surveillance state come out of this shift toward greater prevention, as well as the expansion of the technological tools available for prevention and control during the time Xi Jinping has been in power. With respect to economic security, we've clearly seen a shift in the discourse around economics and security, rather than assuming that development will lead organically to security in places like Xinjiang or Tibet. Xi Jinping has explicitly repudiated that premise now and says, no, security is the precondition for development, or security is the foundation of development. At other times, he uses a more balanced metaphor, just saying that's kind of two wings on one bird, two wheels on one cart. It's a little bit tricky to translate, but the idea is that these concepts have to be interdependent, or if anything, that security actually takes sort of temporal and analytical primacy. It comes first. And so on economic security, what I see increasingly is, okay, the goal isn't necessarily to maximize growth right now. We're actually willing to, as the Chinese party state, take a lower growth rate and maybe take an economic hit in the short term in order to protect long-term economic security. So I actually see it more as a trade-off across different time horizons when it comes to economic security and how we think about China's approach. Those are some of the key ways in which that I think Xi Jinping tries to tackle some of these changes to domestic security. The other thing I'll say is, Xi Jinping has pretty consistently used the language of color revolutions and blamed internal instability on external black hands, foreign subversion, etc. If you look at, for example, the Ministry of State Security Weixin account, that comes up a bit. I'm probably understating there. But one of the ways to interpret some of the changes Xi Jinping has made, again, gradually or incrementally piecemeal over the course of a decade, is to close off potentially destabilizing avenues of foreign influence. So if you look at the foreign NGO law, if you look at the tightening of business, if you look at constraints put on journalists, if you look at places like Xinjiang, where there was particularly transnational religiously based communication, if you look at Hong Kong, that has always been considered a particular site of concern about external infiltration or foreign subversion, right? So both geographically and functionally in different sectors of Chinese society, we've seen an effort to basically seal off, or at least control, potentially destabilizing vectors of foreign influence. And I think that's another key piece of the way that China has tried to approach and manage some of these security threats in this, again, very broad framework that Xi Jinping has constructed.
Thank you. There are 2 points that I want to follow up on. The first that you mentioned, which is really important, is that Xi's approach has become more preventive and less reactive, and he wants to address the root cause, not the symptoms. Given this, has he encountered any pushback domestically, potentially from folks within the Chinese bureaucracy or from Chinese public intellectuals? It seems that to be preventive, you have to actually be more proactive in dealing with national security. Do you find that to be the case? The second point I wanted to follow up on is you mentioned the balance between economic growth and economic security. I think that's an area where there's a big difference between taking a more proactive versus reactive approach. Could you unpack that a little bit to discuss if you're seeing any pushback at all within China on what Xi Jinping and the CCP are currently doing?
With respect to your question about this debate or possible debate over economics versus security, let me start by acknowledging that the Chinese political system has become increasingly opaque, and we've lost some of the sources of information that scholars and analysts often had to try to understand lines of debate or discussions about trade-offs within the Chinese political system as policies were being developed and implemented and feedback collected on how that affects the system's performance. So we don't have a lot of great information about whether or not there's internal pushback within the system to this prioritization of security. But there have been some interesting clues in the official statements released by different actors in the Chinese political system recently that suggest that maybe there's some concern at senior levels over whether or not tools like the counter-espionage law have created an unfriendly business environment in China. Again, with a security justification that the party state might consider valid, but with costs that maybe weren't fully anticipated with respect to foreign investment or overall economic performance. Again, this is guesswork and speculative, but there have been some recent statements that make me wonder if there's a discussion about that that's going on that we simply don't have good visibility on. With respect to pushback on other policies, like the Chinese leadership's escalation of repression in Xinjiang, certainly I think there's been vocal disapproval and criticism from human rights advocates and Uyghurs who've left China, or the family members of people who remain in China imprisoned or incommunicado, and so are reliant on outside voices to advocate for them. A number of UN rapporteurs some years ago released a statement of concern that criticized China's behavior and its policies in Xinjiang because they were disproportionate to the potential perceived threat. One of the things that's actually fascinating about China's use of medical metaphors and metaphors like immunization that are highly preventive is that we don't typically vaccinate people for illnesses they've already had. We vaccinate them before they've even been exposed or showed any symptoms. And so that medical metaphor of immunization really makes clear that China's behavior in Xinjiang is targeting people who haven't done anything to warrant that scrutiny or certainly that targeted repression that they're subsequently subject to. And I think the use of these preventive metaphors really makes that clear and explains some of the criticism that China has received for its policies there. But again, that criticism has largely come from external voices. Whether or not criticism would be more vocal and more frequent if people were in an environment where they felt like they could speak freely about their opinions, we simply don't know. I would guess that that's probably the case, that there would be more vocal criticism if the environment was not so repressive. But what happens in spaces where domestic political voices are shut down or threatened is that often it's left to actors on the outside, members of the diaspora or others, to voice those criticisms. And that seems to be what we are seeing, again, largely in places like Tibet and Xinjiang.
And what else is China doing in addition to being proactive? Have you seen under Xi Jinping the punishment go up for what China views as offenses in the national security realm? In other words, if actors take the same sort of action that are deemed either as a crime or politically problematic, have you seen the punishment or what they suffer as a result of those actions increase under Xi Jinping?
One of the really challenging features of a highly preventive concept of social control, like the one that Xi Jinping uses, is that it actually moves the party state's use of repression earlier and into more private spaces, which makes it intrinsically harder for outside observers to catch, to measure, and to analyze. So, for example, rather than having a mass public crackdown on a protest, the police might go and detain the organizers in their homes before they even get out to the street where someone could see and observe repression occurring. And so I think this is part of the challenge that we have, is that as Xi Jinping has moved the party state toward this more preventive concept, it's also become harder to observe the acts of repression themselves and to know how their frequency and scale are changing. And that, combined with the broader loss of some of the information that we used to have about the internal and social dynamics of popular participation or mobilization at the grassroots level in China, has posed a real analytical challenge for those of us who want to understand these dynamics in the Chinese political system.
Perhaps another ramification of preventive action is that your average Chinese citizen may not necessarily see how much resentment or how much unhappiness there is if the CCP is really successful at preventing protests before they occur. And as a result, there's a decrease in the ability for collective action or mobilization.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Certainly, I think the more controlled a political environment is, the more citizens believe that the party state has the ability to detect what they're doing ahead of time and stop them and impose a punishment, and the more likely they may be to be deterred from doing anything to challenge either a local or national authority or policy at all. But that also creates increased informational problems for the internal security apparatus, because the more preference falsification they induce, the more trouble they're going to have understanding what people are really upset about and what their threshold for acting on it might actually be. And so I think that actually one way to read what happened with the zero COVID protests is that the security apparatus had been relatively successful at one goal, the short-term suppression, but that it may have missed the long-term buildup of some pretty intense dissatisfaction with the consequences of that policy that then bubbled over into public in multiple localities simultaneously. So it's really a double-edged sword for the CCP. It does not necessarily appear to be one, at least by any public sources that I see the regime grappling with, but it's a well-known dynamic in authoritarian political systems, and I don't expect that China would be exempt.
And to deal with this problem that China is facing, how are you seeing artificial intelligence and increased surveillance technology being used? You mentioned earlier that technology was a key factor in China's control on society and its ability to understand what's going on. In what ways are you seeing Xi Jinping and the CCP leadership starting to rely heavily on artificial intelligence and surveillance technology?
There's no question that there's been a very large buildup and investment in the surveillance state under Xi Jinping. A lot of that has been funded and organized at the local level, and so we've seen some problems with aggregating and integrating the data from these various platforms. And I also think it's important to note that even the most technologically advanced surveillance systems in the world, I would put China's among them, or the East German Stasi during the height of the Cold War, they didn't ever let go of the sort of human dimension of surveillance. And whether that's a feature of, again, of Leninist political systems or just a recognition that data collected via technical means still requires some level of human interpretation, I don't know. But even as we've seen this push to invest in surveillance and big data analytics on the back end and things like that, China hasn't really let go of the older, more traditional human inputs and aspect of its societal surveillance programs. And I think that's an important piece to just flag for listeners and for people who are watching this system, that it's easy to focus on the tech at the point of collection, but that misses a little bit just how many humans are involved in administering this and making the surveillance state function as well.
Thank you, Sheena. Let me now transition to look at foreign policy. From your perspective, how does China's prioritization of national security change China's foreign policy, if at all? And a related question, and one that we often get at CSIS, is how does China's internal stability increase or decrease China's willingness to use military force abroad?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that question. Let me answer the later question first about how internal security concerns or perceived threat might increase or decrease China's willingness to be assertive or militarily aggressive abroad. First of all, I think the impact on Chinese foreign policy of these internal security dynamics has grown over time. In some ways, that's actually to be expected, because a lot of Xi Jinping's thinking attributes internal instability or domestic security challenges to external forces, to black hands, to foreign subversion, etc. And because his approach is so highly preventive, if you believe that the sources of your domestic security problems are abroad and you want to prevent the source of that problem or get to the origin of that problem, then it has to have a foreign policy component and an external dimension to solving your domestic security challenges. And so the answer to your question is that if China believes that some of the sources of its internal instability have origins externally that have to be addressed, then I think it will be willing to be more assertive in addressing those challenges abroad. and simultaneously more repressive at home. I actually think that is the sort of fundamental issue that explains much of Xi Jinping's combination of increased repressiveness at home and increased assertiveness abroad. It's very different from a concept that's sometimes been in U.S. national security strategies, where we see discussion of, okay, we've got domestic challenges at home, so we're going to pare back and retrench and focus on challenges at home first. In some ways, this is the opposite correlation. Then with respect to your question about, how does this show up in PRC foreign policy concretely? Because I said earlier that I think that it increasingly has affected and shaped Chinese foreign policy over time. There are a couple of ways in which that's happened. First, Xi Jinping started saying in the late 2010s that he wanted the internal security apparatus to adopt a more global vision for state security work or national security work. And the international security apparatus responded. I think that we've been a little bit slow to view China's internal security leaders as foreign policy actors, but in my view, they are. I have a piece coming out later this spring in Parameters, a journal with the Army War College, that looks at the international diplomatic engagements of China's top internal security officials, the Minister of Public Security, the head of the Central Political Legal Commission, and some other folks. And, they are very active international diplomats. And so I think we need to start considering them not just as domestic police chiefs or internal security czars, but as foreign policy players in China's international and foreign security policy. The other piece where this is really showing up in Chinese foreign policy is in the implementation of the Global Security Initiative. And I know that when GSI was rolled out, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that it was vague and a lot of the components kind of sounded like things that Chinese leaders had said before. Coincidentally, that was also true of the comprehensive national security concept, but the purpose of the comprehensive national security concept was not to be a wholly new idea. It was to provide the intellectual architecture for what's been a pretty transformative approach to security and internal security under Xi Jinping. And I think GSI is starting to get traction, and we're starting to see some of the bigger changes in the world that may result from this framework that China laid out, again, in fairly vague and loose form in its statements and proposals about GSI. One of the arguments GSI makes is that the current global security architecture, which it largely attributes to the U.S., is inadequate for dealing with contemporary global security challenges, particularly non-traditional security challenges that have to do with public order, public safety, and non-traditional security threats. And so China puts forward its own proposals under GSI. And what's really interesting is that as more and more countries sign up for GSI, I think we're up to 70 or 75 countries that have expressed some level of rhetorical support for GSI to date. As we see more and more countries sort of accept these principles in GSI, we also see an increasing number of bilateral security cooperation agreements that are where the sort of the rubber meets the road and some of the implementation and security cooperation starts happening. So take Hungary, for example. It's a European country whose external security is provided for by NATO, nonetheless just signed a security cooperation pact with China. And I have some work now with Isaac Carden that looks at why is that? Why does China find security cooperation from both the United States and China appealing? And the answer is that China is providing assistance on regime security concerns that are very consistent with its own comprehensive national security concept and that might be appealing to Orban particularly as the head of a backsliding democracy, and that the United States is not in the business of generally providing. So it's law enforcement, it's policing, it's other types of internal security assistance that China has developed a comparative advantage in, particularly if you don't care about democracy and the rule of law, but also for a broader array of non-traditional security challenges that high-end conventional defense cooperation with the United States isn't necessarily focused on addressing. And so again, I think as China develops some more robust, practical cooperation under GSI, we're likely to see more and more of these types of security cooperation arrangements. And it's really interesting because I think that we're seeing a shift in the global security environment. The United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War each had their client states to whom they provided both internal and external security. Very few states crossed that Cold War divide. The United States largely took itself out of the internal security assistance game, mostly on human rights and grounds and concerns about repression. But we're now in an international environment, therefore, where you see these different but very overlapping types of security arrangements that third countries are pursuing with both the US and China. It's a fundamental difference from the Cold War, and it'll be very interesting to see how that international security environment and landscape evolves. I think it's going to pose some real challenges for American and international security policymakers, and it'll be interesting to see how those trends develop.
大家好，我是六度世界的六博士，我与小六子为大家主持华尔街故事节目，主要内容包括：一、金融科技突破，挑战传统银行；二、药品专利到期，仿制药股上升；三、量化交易盛行，对冲基金策略变革。那么，小六子可以先跟我们说说金融科技突破，挑战传统银行。
各位听众，今天我们来聊聊一个让传统银行家们夜不能寐的话题——金融科技的突破。这个话题就像是在讲一部科幻小说，只不过这本小说的作者是现实。在很久很久以前，也就是大约10年前，如果你想要借钱，你可能需要穿上你最好的西装，带上一叠文件，走进一家银行，然后在那里跟一位不苟言笑的银行经理谈判。但是现在，你只需要拿起你的智能手机，点几下屏幕，就能在几分钟内得到回应。这就是金融科技的魔力。金融科技或者说 FinTech 是一个涵盖了很多不同技术的大散词，从移动支付到区块链，从人工智能到大数据分析，这些技术正在挑战传统银行业的每一个角落，就像是一群机器人入侵了一个中世纪的城堡，让所有的守卫都措手不及。举个例子，你们知道 P2P 借贷吗？这是一种让个人直接借钱给其他个人的平台，完全绕过了传统银行。这就像是你在社交活动中直接找到你想要认识的人，而不是等待主办方给你介绍。这种去中介化的趋势让银行家们感到害怕，因为他们的角色变得越来越像是那个在派对上无人搭理的角落里的人。再来看看移动支付，这可是一个让银行家们失眠的噩梦。在一些国家，像是中国，移动支付已经变得如此普及，以至于你可以不带钱包出门，只需要带上你的手机。这就好比是魔术师在你的钱包上施了一个隐形咒语，然后所有的钱都跑到了你的手机里。当然，我们不能不提区块链和加密货币。这些技术正在重新定义什么是货币，什么是信任。传统银行是建立在信任的基础上的，但是区块链提供了一种不需要中央机构就能达成共识的方法。这就像是突然之间，你不需要那个一直告诉你我是可信的银行经理了，因为你有了一个全球的记账员团队。总之，金融科技的突破正在挑战传统银行业的根基。这是一场革命，或者更准确的说，是一场进化。传统银行要么适应新的环境，要么就会像恐龙一样被淘汰。而对于我们消费者来说，这是一个好消息，因为这意味着更多的选择、更低的成本和更好的服务。只是别忘了，当你在用你的智能手机进行交易时，偶尔抬头看看周围的世界，毕竟现实生活中没有弹出窗口提醒你人生不只有屏幕。
谢谢小六子的介绍，那再跟我们介绍一下药品专利到期，仿制药股上升。
好的，让我们以一种轻松的方式来探讨这个看似枯燥却又充满戏剧张力的话题：药品专利到期，仿制药股上升。想象一下，药品市场就像是一个古老的王国，专利药就是那些高高在上的贵族，他们拥有特权，可以在一定时间内独享市场的丰厚利润。这些贵族们穿着昂贵的衣服，也就是专利保护，四处炫耀他们的独特配方和治疗效果。他们的存在对于那些需要治疗的平民来说，既是希望又是负担，因为这些药品往往价格不菲。然而，就像所有好戏一样，专利药的专利保护期总有一天会到期，这就像是贵族失去了他们的特权，不再能够独占市场。 这时，仿制药制造商就像是一群等待机会的商人，他们一直在旁边观察，等待着将这些昂贵的药品变成平民也负担得起的商品。当专利一到期，这些仿制药制造商就会迅速行动，他们会使用与原药品相同的活性成分，制造出效果相似但价格更低廉的药品。这就好比是市场上突然出现了一批高仿的名牌商品，虽然没有了原本的品牌光环，但质量却相差无几，而且价格更是亲民的多。这时候，市场上的气氛就会变得热闹起来。原本的专利药贵族们不得不降价以保持竞争力，而仿制药商人则是抢占市场份额，他们的股票就像是被发现的新大陆，吸引着投资者的目光和资金。这场专利与仿制的战争不仅让市场充满了变数，也让那些需要药物的平民百姓看到了更多的选择和希望。当然，对于那些投资者来说，这也是一个机会和挑战并存的时刻。他们需要像探险家一样，精准地判断哪些仿制药公司将会成为新的市场霸主，哪些则可能会在竞争中落败。总之，药品专利到期的故事就像是一部充满策略和变化的史诗大片，既有贵族的没落，也有平民的崛起，更有投资者的智慧与勇气的考验。而在这一切的背后，是对于人类健康和福祉的不懈追求，这才是这个故事最动人的核心。
谢谢小六子的介绍，那再跟我们介绍一下量化交易盛行，对冲基金策略变革。
好的，让我们来聊聊这个既专业又有趣的话题。量化交易如何让对冲基金的策略经历了一场华丽的变革？首先，我们得了解一下量化交易是什么。简单来说，量化交易就像是把华尔街的交易员们变成了一群情感稀薄的机器人，他们不会因为股市的起伏而心潮澎湃，也不会因为某个 CEO 的魅力而心花怒放。量化交易使用复杂的数学模型和算法来分析市场数据，然后自动执行交易。这就好比是在玩一个超级复杂的电子游戏，但是你的对手是市场，而且游戏的奖励是真金白银。随着计算机和数据科学的发展，量化交易开始在金融市场上崭露头角。对冲基金这些金融界的狡猾狐狸很快就意识到量化交易的潜力，他们开始招募物理学家、数学家和计算机科学家，而不是传统的金融分析师。这些新兵被称为量化，他们的加入就像是给对冲基金注入了一剂强心针。在量化交易的帮助下，对冲基金的策略变得更加多样化和复杂。传统的基于直觉和基本面分析的投资策略开始显得有点老派。量化策略可以在毫秒级别上分析成千上万的股票，找出那些隐藏的微小的定价失误，并迅速利用它们来赚钱。这就像是在超市的打折区找到了被错误标价的商品，然后立刻买下来，转手卖出，赚取差价。但量化交易并不总是一帆风顺，有时候这些算法会出错，就像是一群机器人突然集体短路一样。比如2007年的量化危机，许多量化策略突然同时失效，导致对冲基金损失惨重。这就像是你在玩游戏时，突然发现你的无敌作弊码失效了，而且所有的敌人都冲着你来了。然而，尽管有风险，量化交易的吸引力依然不减。对冲基金继续在这个领域投入巨资，希望找到下一个能够带来超额收益的神秘算法。这场游戏还在继续，而且随着技术的进步，它变得越来越精彩。总之，量化交易让对冲基金的策略变革就像是从手动挡升级到自动挡，虽然偶尔会出现一些故障，但它的效率和精确性是不可否认的。对冲基金和他们的量化战士们将继续在金融市场上寻找那些能够带来利润的算法宝藏。而我们呢，就坐在观众席上，拿着爆米花，享受这场高智商的金融大戏。
各位观众，今天我们聊了3个引人入胜的话题：金融科技的突破、药品专利到期和仿制药股的上升、量化交易、对冲基金策略的变革。这些话题都是我们当前金融界的热门议题，也是我们作为普通消费者和投资者应该关注的重要问题。首先，金融科技的突破正在改变传统银行业的运作方式。从 P2P 借贷到移动支付，从区块链到加密货币，这些新技术正在重新定义金融服务的形式和效率。这对我们消费者来说是一个好消息，因为我们可以获得更多的选择、更低的成本以及更好的服务。不过，我们也要记得在享受科技带来的便利的同时，保持对现实生活的关注。其次，药品专利到期和仿制药股的上升是一个让人瞩目的现象。 这场专利与仿制的战争不仅让市场充满了变数，也让那些需要药物的平民百姓看到了更多的选择和希望。对于投资者来说，这也是一个机会和挑战并存的时刻，他们需要像探险家一样，精准地判断哪些仿制药公司将会成为新的市场霸主。最后，量化交易的兴起让对冲基金的策略经历了一场华丽的变革。这种基于数学模型和算法的交易方式，让对冲基金能够更精确地分析市场，迅速执行交易。虽然有时候会出现故障，但量化交易的吸引力依然不减。对冲基金和他们的量化战士们将继续在金融市场上寻找能够带来利润的算法宝藏。最后，我想问问你们，对于金融科技的突破、药品专利到期和仿制药股的上升、量化交易对冲基金策略的变革，你们有什么样的想法呢？请留言和我们分享吧。谢谢大家收看6度穿越系列节目。这个节目由媒体专业人士、科学家、工程技术人员编纂、设计、制作。但是，这些内容并非用于做出决策或法律裁定的基础。欢迎在节目留言区发表您的见解，纠正节目可能存在的错误。谢谢大家收看，欢迎订阅我们的频道，给我们节目点赞。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间3月18日。这期热点深度，一起来关注中纪委反腐，正向所谓的家人持股、合作投资开刀。习近平新年强调，反腐败绝不能回头，不能松懈，不能慈悲。结合到《纽约时报》曾曝光，温家宝家族其亲属掌控的价值超过27亿美元的巨额财富，这会意味着习近平会更进一步向常委级别的人物宣战吗？2024年3月中旬的周末，中国纪检监察报刊文，中国纪检监察报通报新型腐败案例，严查以合作投资为名受贿。20届中央纪委3次全会要求把严惩政商勾连的腐败作为攻坚战重中之重。按照规定，投资入股属于营利性活动，党员干部、公职人员不得违规从事或参与。而有一些领导干部以合作投资为名掩盖权钱交易实质。南华早报通过梳理这篇文章提到，中纪委正将目标对准以虚假商业投资分红形式收受贿赂的干部，并称这种腐败现象正变得越来越普遍、隐蔽和复杂。上述刊登在中国纪检监察报的文章提到，在一些案件中，官员们从企业中获取回报，但并未实际投资该企业或参与其运营。在许多情况下，投资的公司没有实际运营或利润，只向少数股东及官员或其白手套分配红利。中纪委列举了国家开发银行湖北省分行原副行长杨德高的案例，称2005年至2014年，杨德高利用职务上的便利，与其他3名国家工作人员一同帮助某公司从国家开发银行湖北分行获取贷款。期间，杨德高等4人向该公司负责人赵某某提出向该公司投资200万元，并每年获取定额分红。赵某某为感谢杨德高等人帮助，同意该投资入股方案。杨德高等人先后7次从该公司获得分红款共计800万元，并收回本金200万元。经鉴定，杨德高等4人共获取高于出资应得收益748万余元，其中杨德高获取高于出资应得收益374万余元。杨德高还存在其他严重违纪违法问题，被开除党籍，取消退休待遇，因犯受贿罪被判处有期徒刑12年。南华早报提到，中国政府曾多次警告数百万共产党干部不要投资私募股权，以避免出现腐败成熟的所有权状况。党内规定明确禁止官员参股非上市公司，仅限于投资上市股票。官员还必须每年向纪检监察部门报告其家庭的投资情况，包括股票、房产和保险。此外，公务员法还规定，公职人员不得违反有关规定从事或者参与营利性活动，在企业或者其他营利性组织中兼任职务。中纪委称，为了规避这些规定，
避免被调查。有的国家工作人员但于被查处，往往以私下签订合作投资协议作为不显名股东，或以家人、亲属或其指定的第三人名义进行合作投资等方式隐名入股。表面上看，国家工作人员只是借他人名义违规经商办企业，但当国家工作人员没有实际出资和参与管理、经营，而以权力来获取干股收益，这就成了典型的隐性受贿。过去10多年，习近平一直将解决庞大政党中的腐败问题作为其标志性议题。多年来，这场反腐运动已让150多万名政府官员落马。仅今年1年，中纪委对价值61万亿美元的金融部门的打击，就使100多名高管和官员落马。中纪委今年1月表示，去年约有11万名党员干部受到纪律处分，比上一年增加了 13%。根据南华早报的统计，去年中纪委对45名高级官员展开了腐败调查，创下历史新高，而且几乎没有迹象表明这种情况会很快结束。习近平在今年1月对中纪委的指示中说，他认为这些工作对党的长期执政以及党的先进性和纯洁性至关重要。或许是巧合，在同一个周末，中央纪委国家监委网站刊文管好身边人，女干部落马，8名亲属被查，揭露了广东省清远市清新区委原书记郑小燕严重违纪违法案，涉及亲属人数多、贪腐时间长、介入公权力程度深的情况。2023年2月，广东省清远市清新区委原书记郑小燕涉嫌严重违纪违法被查，2023年8月被双开。2024年1月，郑小燕因犯受贿罪被判处有期徒刑13年，处罚300万元。文章提到，郑小燕生于1964年11月，清远市青城区人，长期在清新县。2012年撤县社区任职，曾任县长。2013年4月至2019年10月，任清新区委会书记。文章揭露，2008年至2019年，郑小燕利用职务便利，在土地开发、征地拆迁、建设用地指标调配、政府工程项目承揽、工程款拨付等方面为他人谋取利益，直接或透过亲属非法收受巨额财物4428万余元。郑小燕依照血缘亲疏分层授权原则，他将职权当特权，将公权当私器，精心打造家人腐败圈，为敛财各司其职。2003年1月，郑小燕前往清新县任职，其后便处心积虑为自己和亲属谋取利益。郑小燕的安排下，她的丈夫、弟弟、妹妹、女婿，甚至丈夫的妹夫、弟弟的连襟等多人牵涉其中。2006年，郑小燕指使当时47岁的丈夫陈某提前退休。每当社会老板有所请托，郑小燕不置可否，暗示对方有空找陈某喝茶。有工程项目即将开标，郑小燕便与陈某商量给哪位老板承接，让陈某出面对接，洽谈好处费。郑小燕指使弟弟郑某夫妇双双辞去公职。他也安排以移民加拿大的妹妹代为接收，保管巨额贿赂，光是2笔贿赂款总额就逾2000万元。为了逃避调查，郑小燕甚至强迫其10几年间滞留国外。2008年8月，郑小燕升任清新县县长后，一些亲属也助其继续贪腐。在其帮助下，黄某、陈某的妹夫、欧某、郑某的连襟承接了数亿元政府工程项目，郑家从中获利数千万元。郑小燕的女婿及其亲属在清新涉足房地产等多个领域，背后全靠郑小燕。文章指，黄某6年内承接了12项政府工程，对郑小燕很是忠心，除了为其买商铺、搞装修，还代为保管赃物300余万元。郑小燕主要依亲疏程度决定好处费比。对亲弟弟郑某，他分文不取；对没有血缘关系的人，帮忙可以，该收的钱分文不能少。如黄某需按利润的 40% 支付好处费，欧某则要将利润的 75% 分给郑家。2013年至2019年间， 郑嘉诚接清新区大部分政府工程项目，其他经营者如果没有向郑小燕行贿，很难顺利承揽项目。2019年，郑小燕被调离清新区。2022年，清远市纪委监委对郑小燕相关问题线索进行全面初核。2023年2月6日，清远市纪委监委对郑小燕立案审查调查，并先后对郑小燕及陈某、郑某、黄某等采取留置措施。中国官员通过所谓的合作投资暗地进行权钱交易，甚至有意无意借助自己的职位拉上亲戚一起加入贪腐活动。梳理过去10多年中国的时政往事，在有媒体披露过的一众中国高官中，你是否想起一个人？2012年，美国《纽约时报》以该报驻上海首席记者张大卫调查整理的事实资料为依据，于2012年10月25日大篇幅发布了关于时任中华人民共和国国务院总理温家宝的家族成员在温家宝担任领导岗位期间，借机贪污了至少27亿美元巨额财富的相关报道。纽约时报在报道中称，他们调查的公司与监管记录的时间跨度为1992年到2012年。虽然温家宝本人名下没有任何财产，但包括温家宝的母亲、老婆、子女、弟弟和内弟在温家宝执政期间，特别是1998年之后，变得非常富有。文章称，温家宝家族的亲友和同事是大陆平安保险公司的合伙人，在2007年控制的资产总价值达22亿美元。温家宝90岁的母亲在平安投资的股份在2007年就高达 1.2 亿美元。温家宝家族还拥有北京一个别墅开发项目的控股公司以及华北一个轮胎厂。他们的公司曾参与包括鸟巢在内的2008年北京奥运会的建设项目。调查结果还显示，温家宝家族的名字都掩藏在复杂的多层朋友或商业伙伴与远亲的合伙企业和投资载体背后。纽约时报的报道披露，平安保险党委书记、董事长马明哲在平安保险公司分业经营改革、私有化和上市的过程中，曾游说温家宝和时任大陆央行行长的戴相龙。温家宝和戴相龙家族在平安保险公司上市前夜，从原国有股东招商局和中远集团等处廉价购得股份。温家宝的妻子张培丽，人送外号张阿姨，在温家宝入驻中南海后，成为中国珠宝产业标准的制定者。他协助建立了中国珠宝行业最权威的2个机构，位于北京的国家珠宝检测中心和位于上海的钻石交易所。在1998年温家宝升任为副总理之后，他的妻子开始协助亲友创办企业。虽然张培丽从来不是直接的股东，但他的亲属却在他协助创办的公司中拥有股份。温家宝的儿子温云松涉足的投资领域非常广泛，获利颇丰。温云松在2000年成立了提供互联网数据服务的优创科技公司，启动资金为500万美元，资金来源于亲戚和他母亲的同事，以及香港富豪郑裕彤身边的一个人。优创科技公司的早期客户来自中国国有证券公司和平安保险。2005年，温云松进军私募股权行业，建立了新天域资本公司，公司在生物科技、太阳能、风能和建筑设备制造领域投资。2010年，新天域收购了香港一家公司 9% 的股权，香港证交所裁定这笔投资违反规定，强迫新天域退回股权，但新天域还是从中获利4650万美元。文章称，中国移动还与他合作成立了新公司，温云松和妻子还持有珠宝公司、网络公司以及动画公司的股份，并通过非直接的方式持有联动优势科技有限公司的股份。结合到稍早3月16日出版的第6期《求是》杂志发表习近平文章，时刻保持解决大党独有难题的清醒和坚定，把党的伟大自我革命进行到底。提到全面从严治党，不是要把人管死，让人畏首畏尾，而是要通过立规矩、正风气，营造积极健康的政治生态和良好环境。习近平在2024年的反腐会把大刀伸到常委的高度吗？好了， 以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注6度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。大家好，欢迎来到我们的突发与现场节目。今天要给大家带来一则关于中国反腐的新闻。最近，中纪委针对所谓的家人持股和合作投资开展了反腐调查，这被认为是对常委级别的人物宣战。中纪委称，一些官员利用合作投资作为掩盖权钱交易的手段，这种腐败现象越来越普遍、隐蔽和复杂。值得注意的是，这不是第一次发生，早在2012年，美国《纽约时报》就曝光了温家宝家族涉及的巨额财富。习近平一直将反腐作为其标志性议题，多年来已有超过150万政府官员被查处。这次的反腐行动是否会涉及到常委级别的人物呢？让我们继续关注详细内容，请大家继续收看详细内容。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的辛枫视线。在这张图中，我们所看到的是在2015年的时候，现代汽车投资了80亿元，在中国西南部的重庆新建了一个工厂，目标是要达到年产30万辆内燃机汽车，2年之后建成。但是仅仅6年之后，随着中国消费者迅速转向电动汽车，导致汽油车销售停滞，迫使现代在去年12月以不到2折的价格变卖了这家工厂。出售价仅仅为16亿元人民币，中间还经历了多次流拍，4次降价，最后被重庆国资所接盘。韩国业内人士表示，重庆工厂近年来持续亏损，而中国的汽车市场正面临着供过于求的问题，因此没有人愿意高价收购这家工厂。现代汽车一度是中国最成功的合资车企之一，2016年销量就超过了100万辆。但是短短几年之后，随着中国向电动汽车的迅速转变，令大量的内燃机汽车工厂措手不及，陷入了困境。分析师预计，未来10年，中国汽车市场上将有数百家这样的僵尸工厂。数据显示，2023年，中国生产了1770万辆汽油汽车，较2017年的高峰下降了37%。汽油车销量的断崖式下滑，意味着该行业多达1半的装机容量被闲置。中国1年最多可以生产约5000万辆汽油车，但是现在实际产能只有1半不到。一些老旧工厂将被改装，重新用于生产混合动力车或者纯电动车，但是还有一些工厂将会永远不再投入生产，这给中外企业都带来了难题。业内专家表示，中国的许多汽车集团最终将面临2种选择，要么就让工厂直接停产，要么就生产一些量产车，然后送到俄罗斯或者墨西哥这样的市场。现代汽车退出重庆之际，正伴随着汽油车销量出现自由落体式下滑。现代汽车及其关联公司起亚去年在中国的汽车销量从2016年的近180万辆降至30万辆。与此同时，中国汽车行业激烈的价格战只会给传统汽车制造商带来更大的压力。就连顶级的外资车企丰田、大众和通用都由于在电动车方面进展缓慢，市场份额正在迅速输给比亚迪和特斯拉等公司。在特斯拉之前，外国汽车集团只能通过与中国本地公司成立合资企业的方式进入中国市场。数据显示，在16家中外合资车企中，目前只有5家的产能利用率高于50%，有8家都低于30%。为了应对日益恶化的国内市场形势，中国的车企一直在加大向俄罗斯出口廉价汽油车的力度。因为在俄罗斯入侵乌克兰之后，许多国际汽车制造商都退出了俄罗斯市场。然而，分析人士认为，这一部分的销售无法为中国车企带来有意义和长时间的利润，而其他发展中市场是否能够帮助消化中国的非电动车出口也是一个问题。一些外国品牌也越来越多的尝试从中国工厂出口更多的产品，将多余产能转至海外。但是专家表示，这样做有可能会削弱他们在其他市场的工厂。作为在中国销售量最大的外国汽车制造商，大众在接受《金融时报》采访时 拒绝提供中国产能过剩的数据。但是大众称，汽油车市场仍然有利润，而利润增长主要是来自于中国几百个小城市，这些城市的人口通常在300万以下。因为在比较发达的大城市，汽车保有量已经很高，而且对购买新的汽油车已经有了限制。而就全中国来看，中国的汽车保有量仍然普遍较低，中国平均每1000人只有185辆汽车，而美国每1000人有近800辆汽车，德国则为580辆。因此，在中国的小城市，汽车还是有很大的发展空间。另外一个关键因素是，小城市缺乏充电的基础设施，这阻碍了电动车在当地的发展。大众汽车去年宣布在中国投资50亿欧元，目标是要提高电动汽车的产量。大众已经开始将中国的一些工厂生产线改造为生产电动汽车。大众还称将会努力实现内燃机车型的混合动力化，从而将其转化为新能源汽车。但是大众决定在中国市场加倍努力只是一个例外，其他大多数外国汽车制造商在中国的支出已经停滞，福特汽车正在减少在中国的支出，而在10年前，福特还是中国市场第6大参与者。业内高管表示，中国所有传统汽车制造商面临的最大压力都来自于新型电动车工厂的崛起，这些工厂采用了截然不同的汽车制造方法。比如说，在合肥的蔚来汽车工厂内，品牌创始人李斌认为，电动汽车的客户将会越来越需要具有私人定制功能的车，而不是经销商提供的千篇一律的流水线产品。李斌称，蔚来的汽车工厂在他心目中比保时捷工厂还要好。在合肥的工厂里，你可以看到有8台机器人环绕在车体四周，用不到50秒的时间就可以将2扇车门安装在车体上。机器手臂代替工程师将中控台安装在车身内，耗时也仅需10几秒。中国客户订购一辆蔚来汽车3周左右就可以收到货，欧洲客户则需要90天。未来的合肥工厂不久之后将会具备年产30万辆汽车的能力，而这正是我们节目一开头所提到的现代汽车重庆工厂当时所设立的目标。对于大多数外国汽车集团来说，在中国的好日子已经结束。大众、福特和丰田等公司在中国短时间内遭遇了2次根本性的转型。首先是中国消费者放弃内燃机的速度之快，其次是中国本土电动车品牌的崛起之快。蔚来汽车的合肥工厂经理曾经在通用汽车工作，他表示，中国的所有汽车制造商都在为生存而战，但是不是每个品牌最终都能成功。整合将是下一步。汇丰银行的数据显示，2022年中国近3/4的电动汽车销量集中在销量排名前10的电动汽车品牌中，这就留下了近60个电动汽车品牌的尾巴。如果失去政府支持，其中几十家都看起来前景暗淡。绿色和平组织预测，如果到2030年电动车使用率加快至70%左右，那么通用和大众在中国的滞留产能将会超过200万辆。跨国公司在中国的损失也只是刚刚开始。装载着中国电动车的集装箱正从中国港口出发，其速度之快使得中国已经超越日本，成为全球最大的汽车出口国。外国汽车制造商现在不仅需要考虑他们在中国的生存，很快他们将需要在自己的国家也面临这样的生存之战。而关于这部分的内容，我们前几天也做了相关的节目，专门介绍了比亚迪等中国电动车现在在全球的地位，感兴趣的朋友可以一步观看。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道，我们下期节目再见。
6度旅行管家，你的旅行全策划。注册或登录6度世界，点击右上角机器人按钮，然后选择6度旅行管家，就可以开始与 AI 对话了。
你好，很高兴能为你服务。你打算去哪里旅行呢？
我想去希腊。
太棒了，希腊是一个美丽的国家。你对希腊的哪些方面感兴趣呢？比如历史遗迹、美食、海滩或者其他的？
海滩和美食。
好的，了解了。你有没有任何饮食禁忌或者特殊的饮食要求，比如素食、无麸质食品等？
不吃牛肉。
好的，我会注意在推荐餐厅时避免牛肉。你计划的旅行时间是多久呢
？4天。
了解了。你是打算独自旅行，还是和他人一起？这会影响到旅行的安排。
与父母一起。
好的，我会考虑到这一点。你的预算大概是多少呢？这会影响到住宿和餐饮的选择。
1000欧一天。
好的，这是一个相当宽裕的预算。你对住宿有什么特别的要求吗？比如希望住在市中心，或者希望有海景，或者需要特别的设施？
希望有海景。
根据你的需求，我为你找到了一些在希腊的海景酒店。这些酒店都有很好的海景，你可以根据你的喜好和预算来选择。接下来，我将为你规划一个4天的旅行行程。你希望在这4天里每天都去海滩吗？还是希望有1天或2天去参观一些历史遗迹或者市区
？1天海滩，2天历史遗迹，1天市区。
根据你的要求和我从网络上找到的信息，我为你制定了以下的旅行计划。第1天，海滩。你可以选择去希腊最美的海滩之一，比如 Eleftheris 海滩或 Navigo 海滩。这些海滩都有清澈的海水和美丽的景色，在那里你可以尽情享受阳光和海滩，或者参加一些水上活动。第2天和第3天，历史遗迹。第2天，你可以参观希腊最著名的历史遗迹之一雅典卫城，在那里你可以看到帕台农神庙和其他古代建筑。第3天，你可以选择去德尔菲，这是一个古代的宗教中心，也是世界遗产之一。或者你也可以去克诺索斯宫，这是欧洲最古老的城市之一。第4天，市区。在雅典市区，你可以参观一些有趣的地方，比如古老的坡卡区、现代的购物中心，或者一些美术馆和博物馆。你也可以在当地的餐厅品尝希腊美食，比如希腊沙拉、烤羊肉和橄榄油面包。住宿推荐。根据你的预算和要求，我为你找到了一些海景酒店的推荐，这些酒店都有优美的海景，同时也提供高质量的服务。餐饮推荐。在希腊，你可以尝试一些当地的美食，比如希腊沙拉、烤羊肉和橄榄油面包。但是请注意，由于你不吃牛肉，所以在点餐时需要提醒服务员。希望这个旅行计划能满足你的需求。如果你有任何问题或需要更多的信息，欢迎随时向我提问。